CD7.
Chapter 32. Incheon Airport, South Korea. The passengers of Air France Flight 264 from Paris to Seoul gathered their things in the orderly but eager fashion of those who'd been cooped up in a metal tube for too long, as if the 11 hours on the aircraft were more easily endured than the 5 minutes it took to unload and escape into the terminal. An announcement that the jetway had malfunctioned was met with a universal groan. But the opening of the rear doors allowed fresh air into the cabin, and soon the passengers were streaming down the stairs at the rear of the aircraft. This odd method of emptying the aircraft meant that the passengers in the rear went first, while those in first class had to endure the interminable delay. In the very first row, in seat 1A, Arturo Solano did little to hide his displeasure. The only solace was a few more minutes staring at the shapely American woman who sat next to him. They'd spoken all too briefly during the flight, but as the other first-class passengers filed out, she turned his way. He knew the look. A few words about art and parties, and most women went weak in the knees. She was going to ask him if she might attend the party, or perhaps even meet privately for dinner. With a mischievous eye, she watched the last of the first-class passengers disappear through the curtain, and then smiled. "I know what you want," he said in his best English. "Do you?" she replied. "Of course," he said. "I'd be delighted to put you on the guest list." "I'm flattered," she said, glancing forward as the front cabin door opened. "But since you won't be going, there's no need for me to attend." Solano felt a moment of confusion. It grew deeper as 3 Korean men in dark suits appeared, entering through the supposedly broken jetway. He stood up, indignant and suspicious, but the woman jabbed him with something. He felt a shock go through his body and then became rapidly drowsy. He fell into her waiting arms and began to doze even as she laid him down on the cabin floor. Shortly before he passed out, another man entered. This man wore a white linen suit, identical to Solano's own. His hair was coiffed in the same nouveau pompadour style, and his face sported a goatee. In fact, as this new arrival stared down at him, Solano felt as if he might be looking in a mirror. "Who are you?" Solano managed to whisper. "I'm you," the man replied. Baffled and too drowsy to form another thought, Solano closed his eyes and fell asleep. 2 of the Korean men dropped down beside him and pulled him upright. As they folded his unconscious body into a cart disguised as a catering trolley, the woman in the business suit took Joe by the arm. "Time for us to exit," she said. "Acosta sent a driver to pick Solano up. Say as little to him as possible. We'll get Solano talking and get you some audio to listen to so you can mimic his voice." "No problem," Joe said. He grabbed Solano's briefcase and followed the woman toward the aft end of the plane. Minutes later, he was in the terminal, meeting with Acosta's driver, who picked up the rest of Solano's luggage and led him to a waiting limo. "What hotel?" Joe asked, using accented English. "Sheila Hotel," the driver insisted. 5 stars. Monsieur Acosta has spared no expense and is very excited to see you. Joe only nodded and sat back in the plush seat until the driver shut the door. He wasn't concerned. He knew that the CIA and the South Korean security forces were listening in. They would track him, and when they were certain the coast was clear, they would contact him. Until then, there was nothing to do but enjoy the ride. Miles away, Kurt Austin was less relaxed. What had begun as a personal mission in search of answers had now become an international operation that had put his best friend at the tip of the spear. Kurt spent hours studying the schematics of Tanrang's skyscraper, where the party would be held. The 52-story glass and steel building was a marvel of engineering. It rose like a monolith in the heart of Seoul. 11 floors up, one side was cut away, and an ornate garden and outdoor terrace offered some of the best views in the city. Kurt noticed that the garden was protected by a glass atrium, the rest being open to the elements. He learned that the elevators ran through a central column and that there were stairwells at all four corners. He found that access corridors ran behind certain walls and that there were many narrow spaces designed for pipes and electrical conduits that had entry and exit points to allow maintenance access. Having learned all he could about Tan Rong's building, he turned to other distractions, looking over the photos he'd taken of Acosta's yacht and zooming in on the faces of those who'd been caught in the snapshots. Acosta's bulbous head was clearly visible in several photos, as was the blonde woman Acosta had spoken to out on the deck. As Kurt studied her features, he began to think she looked familiar. Her cheekbones were high, her eyes were a dark brown, and her eyebrows darker still. She wasn't a blonde at all, he thought. He zoomed in closer and realized who it was. "A woman in disguise," he said, recognizing the face of the mystery intruder he'd fought with in Acosta's cabin. He plugged the camera into a computer terminal. With a few keystrokes, he uploaded the shot. That done, he picked up the phone and dialed a Washington number. The phone rang a half-dozen times before a grumpy voice answered. "Hello? Hiram, this is Kurt." "I hope I'm dreaming this," Hiram Yeager said. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" Kurt had almost forgotten the 14-hour time differential from Seoul to D.C. "I've always heard time as a relative concept," he replied. "Not in this case," Yeager grumbled. "But I assume it's important. What do you need?" "I'm sending you a photo of a pretty woman." "My wife might not appreciate that." "I think it's the mystery woman from the yacht, only she's wearing a blonde wig. It's a clear shot through the zoom lens. Maybe you can run it through your magical machine and figure out who she is, unless that's beyond what the system can handle." Yeager scoffed at the notion. "I'm hurt that you would even doubt us," he replied. "Our facial recognition technology has advanced by leaps and bounds in the last few years. If it's a clear shot and there's any record of her anywhere, we can figure it out. You throw in dinner at Citron, and I'll give your preferred drink, a list of her likes and dislikes, and where she went to school." Kurt laughed. He figured the best way to get Hiram fired up was to challenge him. "It's a deal." "I heard about the computer virus on the Condor," Kurt said. "Are you sure Max is secure?" Max was the name of Hiram's own supercomputing system. Built from scratch to Hiram's exacting specifications, Max was undoubtedly one of the most advanced and powerful computers in the world, and certainly the most unique. It had a high level of artificial intelligence and its own distinctly female personality. "Are you purposely trying to annoy me?" Hiram said. "Of course Max is secure. I built her from the ground up and programmed her myself. No one else in the world has even the most rudimentary understanding of her source code, and without that, a machine can't be compromised. In fact, if everybody built their own computers instead of buying them off the shelf, the world would be a far more secure place." "Okay, fine," Kurt said, not meaning to denigrate Hiram or his machine. "So I don't need to print this out and send it FedEx?" "No," Hiram said. "Just use the secure line the CIA has set up for you. I've scanned their software with ours. It's clear." "Okay," Kurt said. "Sending now. Let me know what you find out." "Will do." Yeager hung up, and Kurt had no doubt that the inquisitive computer genius was already crawling out of bed to get the research going immediately. He almost felt guilty, but he had a feeling that time was not on their side. Chapter 33. Joe Zavala arrived at Tan Rong's building in a limo. He wore a tailored white suit and a silver tie straight from Solano's wardrobe. Kurt traveled with him, wearing a more traditional black suit and carrying a small briefcase with the tools of Solano's trade and a transmitter he and Joe hoped to secure on the hackers. As a last-minute precaution, Kurt's silver hair had been cut short and temporarily dyed black, in case Acosta had any surveillance footage of him from the yacht. Stepping from the limo, they were directed to a private elevator by Tan Rong's security personnel and took a quick ride up to the 11th floor, where they stepped out into a party that was already in full swing. Spread out across a large ballroom and spilling out onto the rooftop garden were hundreds of South Korea's most powerful and influential people. Industrialists, politicians, and celebrities mixed with poets, artists, and philanthropists. Ambassadors from 5 nations were there, along with dozens of trade representatives, including a group from the United States. To kick the festivities into high gear, Tan Rang appeared on a raised stage at the end of the ballroom. He wore a traditional Korean outfit known as a gongbok, which was an indigo-colored robe of silk tied at the waist with a gray sash and fitted with a high collar. In the ancient dynasties of Korea, the gongbok was the dress of a nobleman or a king. It told Kurt a lot about who Tan Rang thought he was. While there were a few others dressed similar to Tan Rang, most of the guests wore Western clothing. Suits and tuxedos for the men, all variety of bright formal wear for the women. It was a dizzying kaleidoscope of movement and color. "When do you meet up with Acosta?" Kurt asked.
"His message said he'd find me when he needed me, and to enjoy the party until then."
Kurt noticed Joe was speaking with a heavy accent, even though he was using English. He'd been in character since they left the hotel room. The acting classes seemed to be paying off.
"Perhaps you'd like to wait in the garden, sir?"
Kurt asked, speaking in the tone of an assistant.
"Yes," Joe said. "I believe I would. Let's enjoy the cool night air for a while."
They made their way outside to the ornate garden that covered half the 11th floor rooftop. It was lit up by thousands of tiny lights, enough to compete with the glow of the city beyond. The other half of the building rose another 41 stories into the night behind them. Out in the garden, it didn't take long for a trio of women to catch Joe's eye. He flashed a grin, his teeth as white as the jacket he wore. The women responded with smiles of their own, and the 2 boldest of them began to walk his way.
"Must be the suit,"
Kurt whispered.
"I do make it look good,"
Joe replied. "You look like Mr. Rourke," Kurt said. "They're probably hoping for a trip to Fantasy Island."
"That would make you tattoo,"
Joe whispered.
"Let me know if you spot the plane."
As the women came into range, Joe began to hold court, getting their names and their stories and discussing his position in the world of art. If they weren't already weak-kneed from Joe's looks and charm, hearing that he was an international art expert with a big hacienda on a stretch of Spanish beach made them positively melt. As one of them sipped the last of her martini, Joe asked if she'd like another.
"I'd love one,"
she said.
"So would I,"
the second woman added. Without a glance at Kurt, Joe sent him to the bar.
2 martinis and a gin Ricky,"
he said, ordering Solano's favorite drink. His friend was enjoying this, and Kurt could not so much as give him the evil eye. He would have to find a way to repay him later.
Yes, Mr. Solano,"
he said, right away. "Do you require anything else?"
"No," Joe replied with a light sigh. "I seem to have all I need right here."
Kurt handed the briefcase over to Joe and made his way toward the center of the garden, where a circular bar made of glass shimmered with electric blue color where it was lit from within. One of the many bartenders noticed Kurt immediately. As the man went to work, Kurt studied the surroundings, looking for Acosta. So far, he hadn't seen him, but considering the number of guests, that was not a surprise. The blue martinis arrived, made with vodka, curacao, and an ounce of bitters. Shaken and poured, they were almost identical in color to the glowing bar. The gin Ricky was another story. The bartender needed fresh limes. As he went to retrieve them, Kurt's gaze settled on a couple who'd eased up to the bar directly opposite him. The man he didn't recognize, but the woman's face was unmistakable at this point. It seemed the mystery woman from Acosta's yacht had an invite to Tan Rang's party. Her hair was copper-colored now and arrow-straight. It shone like a new penny beneath the lights and was coiffed in an asymmetrical style that framed her face in a way that was both striking and yet well-designed to disguise her features. Despite that, Kurt had no doubt who he was looking at. He'd stared at the photo of her in the blonde wig for hours after sending it to Hiram. He'd burned her features into his mind. The angle of her cheekbones, the narrow bridge of her nose, the arch of her eyebrows, and the little scar that ran through one of them like a part. All these things were easy to make out. He noticed her bottom lip seemed to be swollen, almost bee-stung. Considering it had been bruised and bleeding 4 days prior, that did not surprise him. Nor did it surprise him that she was here. After all, they were chasing the same thing. "Your drink, sir." The bartender had returned. "Thank you," Kurt said. It was an open bar, but Kurt believed in tipping. He handed over a 50,000 won note, the equivalent of about $40. The bartender smiled intently. "Thank you, sir." "You're welcome," Kurt said, lifting the small tray on which the drinks had been placed. "Us working-class guys need to stick together." With the grace of a waiter, Kurt carried the drinks back to Joe, where the women continued to hang on his every word. As soon as the drinks were distributed, Joe handed the bag to Kurt. Before Kurt could explain the latest complication, Acosta appeared. His arrival was enough to scatter the women like spooked doves. The pleasantries were exchanged somewhat awkwardly. "My Spanish is not so good," Acosta managed. "Nor my French," Joe replied. "Perhaps English is better?" "Not better," Acosta grumbled, "but common." Acosta laughed at his own joke and then continued the conversation in accented English. Joe did likewise, doing his best to sound like Solano. "Are you ready?" Acosta asked. "Whenever you are," Joe replied. With that, Acosta and his bodyguards led Joe and Kurt to another elevator guarded by Tanrang's men. As they reached the door, one of the guards pointed at Kurt and shook his head. "He's my assistant," Joe said. "Do you need him?" Acosta replied. "Of course not," Joe said. "He is simply here to carry the bags." Joe snapped his fingers and made a give-it-to-me motion with his hand. Kurt dutifully handed the briefcase over. "Enjoy the festivities," Joe said. "I'll signal you when I return." The elevator door opened. Acosta and Joe stepped inside. As the door shut, Kurt heard the beginnings of a conversation centered on a collection of works by the artist Degas. He hoped Joe's crash course in the world of art would hold up. With little to do but wait, Kurt turned and went back to the bar. His main priority now was to avoid being recognized by one of Acosta's guards or the mystery woman from the yacht. He decided the best way not to accidentally run into her was to follow her and keep an eye on her from a distance. Tracking her was fairly easy, as the shimmer of her copper locks stood out in a crowd of mostly Korean women. Avoiding her gaze was a little more difficult, as her eyes seemed constantly on the move. He only hoped his surveillance technique was better than Joe's. Chapter 34. On the elevator ride to the top floor of Tanrang's building, Joe continued discussing the art of Degas with Acosta, relaying facts and anecdotes with ease. By the time they reached the 52nd floor, Acosta seemed impressed. The elevator opened and let them out into a large foyer. A man with one hand met them there. He was Caucasian. "Kovac," Acosta said. "This is Arturo Solano." Joe nodded, and Kovac offered him a brief glance. "Tanrang is waiting." "Excellent." Together, the three of them made a short trip to Tanrang's private office. Tanrang was already there, still dressed in his indigo robe, looking out over the lights of Seoul through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "We have arrived," Acosta announced. "It's time for the exchange." Tanrang turned. "Assuming your experts pass their final examination." Joe glanced around. The office was sprawling and included a conference room behind smoked glass, but the room was dark, and he saw no sign of the hackers. Wherever they were sequestered to do their final exam, it wasn't on the 52nd floor.
They will pass every test you can devise, Acosta insisted. Of that, I assure you. Then you will have your prize.
Tan Rong extended a hand toward the far wall. There, guarded by 2 additional men, was a small easel. At the center of the easel sat a painting not much larger than a standard sheet of paper. It was surrounded by a gilded frame and bathed in a soft, warm light.
First, we'll run our own tests,
Acosta said confidently.
As you wish.
Acosta led Joe toward the easel.
I'm sure this won't take long.
Joe went to set up, but the guards didn't budge.
Do you mind? Joe asked. I need some room to work.
The guards stepped back a few feet. With some room to breathe, Joe set his case down and studied the painting in the low light. Fortunately, he recognized it. The painting was a Manet. It was known as the Chez Tortoni. Joe ran through what he knew about it in his mind. Oil on canvas, painted by Manet over a period of several years, and finished sometime in 1880. It depicted a French gentleman with a high top hat sitting in a cafe that the artist himself was known to frequent.
But there was something else. Are you surprised to see it again?
Acosta asked, all but chortling. Of course, Joe thought. He'd almost forgotten. It had been stolen, along with a dozen other pieces, from the Gardner Museum in Boston. All told, the value of the missing art was somewhere around $500 million. The bio on Solano indicated he'd been working at the Gardner when the theft happened. Joe reacted calmly.
If it's real, he said, I've seen 6 forgeries of this painting in the last 10 years, some of them quite good. I'll get excited when I know it's the genuine article. I assure you,
Tan Rong said from behind them,
this is the real thing.
Joe shrugged, opened his briefcase, and removed a small device that looked like a camera.
What are you going to do with that?
Tan Rong asked.
It's an infrared scanner, Joe said. Set to the proper frequency, it will look beneath the paint to see if other images are present.
Tan Rong looked a little nervous, and Joe wondered what would happen if an image of Mickey Mouse or Bugs Bunny appeared when he turned on the scanner. Most likely, all hell would break loose between Tan Rong and Acosta and their 2 sets of thugs. Not a crossfire Joe wanted to be in the middle of. He turned the scanner on and studied the painting. Fortunately, no cartoons appeared, but several stray lines were obvious. The design looked like the outline of a small building. Joe made a few notes on a pad and switched the scanner off.
Well?
I'm not done, Joe said.
Lights, please.
The room was darkened, and Joe used an ultraviolet light to test the shades of white pigment.
I see no repairs to this work, he said. No signs that new paint has been added. In fact, the fluorescence level is right on target. The pigments match those from the 1800s.
The lights came back on, and Joe noticed Tan Rong had begun to look pleased.
What about those stray marks?
Few know this, Joe said, making up a story he hoped couldn't be quickly verified.
But Manet painted this work over the beginnings of another. The marks beneath are believed to be the outline of a carriage house in Toulouse. So this is the authentic item?
Or a perfect forgery, Joe said.
What are you suggesting?
Tan Rong blurted out.
Nothing, Joe said. But tell me, did you steal the painting?
Of course not.
Then you bought it from the men or women who did,
Joe pointed out.
By their very nature, that makes them criminals. Surely you didn't take it on face value when you handed them their payment.
The Korean bristled at the remark.
I would not be foolish enough to buy a fake.
There must be some way to tell for sure,
Acosta said.
Bring the lights up to maximum, Joe said. One thing that can't be faked is what's called craquelure. As the painting ages, the oils dry out and the paint cracks. Based on the age of the work and the type of paint used, specific patterns will appear. It is somewhat like an artistic fingerprint. With the lights up, Joe examined the surface of the painting. From what he'd been told, French craquelure tended to form in curving, sweeping lines, while Italian paintings tended to crack in squares or little rectangular blocks, which was why the Mona Lisa looked the way it did up close. To Joe's chagrin, neither pattern appeared on the Manet. There were vertical cracks and a few horizontal ones, but nothing that looked like what he'd been taught to expect. He pulled out a magnifying glass to give himself a second look and to buy himself some time. But the more he looked, the more convinced he became he was looking at a fake. Chapter 35. While Joe played art expert, Kurt tailed the mystery woman from the yacht. The longer he followed her, the more he noticed she was moving in a deliberate pattern. Out from the bar and then back, checking a quadrant of the garden at a time, and then reporting back to her date. She's looking for something, he said to himself. He moved in closer and managed to overhear part of her conversation. The man called her Callista. So now he had a name, even if it was an alias. She shook her head at something the man asked, and then spoke.
Acosta and Tanrang are nowhere to be seen. They must be making the exchange now. Time to get in position.
The man nodded. Very well, he said. Let's be quick.
Kurt turned his back and eased in between two Korean businessmen who were having a spirited debate, nodding his head as if he agreed with something that was being said. The businessmen looked at him oddly, then went back to their conversation. Callista and her date moved past Kurt and separated, heading off in different directions. Kurt followed Callista as she made her way from the terrace into the covered part of the ballroom and down a short hall. She slipped through a doorway and disappeared as it closed behind her. Squinting, Kurt noticed the sign on the door. The ladies' room. He looked for a place to linger, but the hall was a dead end. Instead of getting too close, he actually moved back, loitering in a spot from which he could watch the hall in the reflection of a smoked glass window. Soon enough, the door swung open again. Kurt kept his eyes on the reflection as she made her way back toward the garden. She passed him without a glance. But Kurt noticed something different about her. Her walk had changed. It was more refined, less brisk. The dress seemed to fit a little tighter. The figure inside was a little fuller. Kurt couldn't see her face, but he didn't have to. He knew what he knew. The woman who'd come out of the restroom was not the same one who'd gone in. On the 52nd floor, Joe stared at the painting, wondering what to do. If he pronounced it a fake, all hell would break loose. If he claimed it to be real and it was some kind of test set up by Acosta or even Tanrang, his cover would be blown.
Well,
Tanrang said,
what is your verdict?
Joe stroked the goatee that had been glued to his face. He turned to Acosta and in full character said,
It brings a tear to my eye to see such an old friend once again. Never did I think it would be recovered.
Tanrang relaxed. Acosta sighed. Joe exhaled along with them.
Yes, he said, I can assure you, this is the bona fide work of the master. Look at the touch. Look at the depth. You are both very lucky men.
Very good, Acosta said. He motioned to the man with one hand and pointed to Joe.
Pay him.
A briefcase was produced that looked exactly like Solano's.
The second half of your fee. 100,000 euros, as we agreed.
Joe opened the case, looked over the money, and then shut it quickly.
Unfortunately, even as he did so, the one-handed man was taking the case Joe had brought in with him and carrying it off with the tracking device inside.
My pen, Joe said. It's in the case.
Acosta laughed and slapped Joe on the back.
You can buy a whole factory of pens with what I've paid you.
Joe chuckled in an effort to cover his chagrin, but as the one-handed man was already disappearing into a conference room, he decided not to draw any more attention to himself.
Enjoy the remainder of the evening, Acosta said. Perhaps the young women you were engaged with earlier will still be unattached for the evening. One can only hope, Joe said.
Tan Rong gestured toward the elevator, and Joe walked that way. As the bell pinged and the door opened, Joe heard Tan Rong speaking to Acosta.
Your people have passed a test. Our business is complete. Get them ready to move.
Joe couldn't linger any further. He stepped into the elevator and waited for the doors to close. As soon as the elevator began to descend, Joe activated the micro-transmitter the CIA had given him, a tiny waterproof device that was clipped to one of his molars. He spoke almost silently without moving his mouth.
Got your ears on, buddy?
A moment of silence rang out before Kurt came back. I'm here, Kurt's voice replied. The tiny speaker resonated against a bone in the jaw that connected to the ear. It truly sounded as if Kurt was in his head.
I'm on my way down,
Joe whispered. Mission accomplished?
Not exactly, Joe said. I think we'd better make a quick exit. Stage left, right, center, it doesn't matter.
What's the rush?
Well, for one thing, Joe said, the painting is a fake. I'm pretty sure Tan Rang knows. And if Acosta realizes it, or Tan Rang begins to think that I know and just didn't speak up yet, well, let's just say I wouldn't want to be in Solano's shoes at that point.
Except that you are in Solano's shoes.
Exactly, Joe said. Beyond that, they took the case with the transmitter in it. Gave me a matching one filled with cash. But without the tracer, we can't finish the mission anyway.
Not necessarily, Kurt said. I've found us a plan B.
Plan B?
The one person in the world as interested in locating Sienna as we are. And if I'm right, she's just going into action.
Your mystery woman?
Appearing as a redhead today and going by the name of Callista. The elevator finally hit the 11th floor and stopped. As soon as the doors were open, Joe stepped out.
Let's make this quick. Where are you?
Getting ready to sneak into the ladies' room.
I knew you were desperate, Joe said, but that's taking it a little far, don't you think? She went in a minute ago, Kurt whispered. Someone else came out wearing her clothes. I assume that was to throw off Tan Rang's cameras. But no one else has come out yet at all. Do you think she went out a window or something?
Or a back door, Kurt said. I'm about to go in and find out.
Makes sense, Joe said. On my way.
By the time Joe reached the restroom, Kurt had pulled a janitor's cart in front of the bathroom door and ducked inside. Joe found him looking for a secret panel, knocking on the walls and listening for a hollow spot. There were no windows or back doors to speak of.
What about the air vent?
Joe said, studying the louvered metal grate that covered it.
People don't really climb through air ducts, Kurt said from inside one of the stalls, mostly because they're designed to carry air and people are heavier than air. Especially after all those hors d'oeuvres at the party.
Look at this, Kurt said, waving Joe into the stall and pointing to the floor, where a fine layer of white dust lined the polished granite tile.
Looks like drywall dust, Joe said.
My thoughts exactly, Kurt said as he found a seam that had been hastily covered by a quick-drying plaster, although it wasn't dry yet. With a little effort, Kurt was able to dig his fingers into the seam and pull the panel out. It was a 3-by-3-foot square, just big enough for someone to climb through.
Either they have very large mice or she went through here. Where does it lead? Joe asked.
Kurt put his head inside.
I saw these on the building schematics. It's a crawl space between the walls. Lots of pipes and electrical wire. It's dark to the right side, but there's a sliver of light perhaps 100 feet down on the left. It looks like the crack beneath a door.
Can we fit? Joe asked.
Only one way to find out, Kurt said, climbing in.
Joe locked the bathroom stall door and followed Kurt into the crawl space. He did his best to replace the panel once he was inside, and then turned, immediately banging his head on one of the pipes. The impact reverberated through the dark.
"Keep it down,"
Kurt whispered.
"I can't see anything,"
Joe said.
"Hold on."
As Joe watched, a bluish-white light filled the space, courtesy of the screen on Kurt's phone. It was enough to navigate with, and Kurt began clambering forward. Joe followed until they reached the spot where the light was filtering in.
"Inspection panel," Kurt said.
A small handle in a square metal door presented itself, and Kurt ducked down, twisted the handle, and eased the door open.
"What do you see?"
Joe asked.
"Back office hallway and a fire escape."
Kurt wedged his broad shoulders through the narrow door and out into the hall. Joe followed, squeezing through and straightening up once he was free. Kurt glanced back at him.
"You're a mess."
Joe looked at himself. His spotless white jacket was smudged with black grease and swathes of gray dust. He took it off and removed his tie, stuffing them back into the crawl space before closing the door.
"I was getting tired of that monkey suit anyway," he said. "Which way now?"
"Good question," Kurt said. "Not much she can do back here. If she wants to intercept the hackers, she'll have to beat them to whatever mode of transport they're going to be using."
"There's a helipad on the roof,"
Joe said.
"and a garage underneath the building,"
Kurt added.
"If she was going to take the elevator, she wouldn't have come this way,"
Joe said. "That means she's on the stairs." Without delay, Kurt moved down the hall to the fire escape and eased the door open. Like most fire escapes, the stairs were metal, descending in a rectangular zigzag. Even before he was fully inside, Kurt could hear rapidly moving footfalls echoing in the space. He moved to the edge of the rail as Joe slipped inside and shut the door. Gazing down, he spotted a woman's hand on the rail, moving rapidly toward the basement. But it was not alone. Another hand trailed hers. Kurt stepped back and held up 2 fingers. Joe nodded. Kurt pointed to their feet.
"Shoes,"
he whispered. Joe pulled his shoes off as Kurt was doing the same.
"At this rate, I'm going to be naked by the time we catch up to her."
"That ought to scare her," Kurt replied, "not to mention everyone else involved." Leaving their shoes behind, they began to descend in their socks, treading lightly but quickly and staying away from the inside rail, where a quick look upward from either of the targets might give them away. They were passing the 6th floor and headed for the 5th when the woman and her friend reached the bottom floor. The door at the base of the stairwell opened, and they could hear the unmistakable sound of a gun with a silencer on the barrel. 3 dart-like shots were followed by a dull thud, and then another.
"They've taken someone out,"
Joe whispered. Kurt stooped and peered over the edge. What looked like a pair of guards was being dragged into the stairwell. Callista and the man took several items from the bodies, covered them hastily with a tarp, and then went out through the door into the garage once again.
"What are they up to?"
Joe wondered aloud. Kurt had no idea. When the door banged shut, he started to move again, racing down the stairs as fast as he could. He made it to the bottom of the stairwell and pressed against the door, looking through the wire safety glass window. He saw the woman clearly now. Her hair was short and black again, and she was dressed in a uniform like one of Tanrang's guards.
"She's climbing into the cab of an 18-wheeler,
Kurt said.
"What about her friend?"
Kurt glanced around. He couldn't see the man, but the sound of a door slamming and a slight vibration in the mirror of a second truck suggested he'd gotten in the second rig. For now, they just sat there waiting.
"What's the story on those guys?"
Kurt asked, glancing back to Joe. As Kurt watched the trucks, Joe moved back into the recesses of the stairwell where the dead men were covered by the tarp.
"Ammunition belts and empty holsters," Joe said. "Radio clips on their belts are empty. I guess these men are security specialists, not drivers."
"Makes sense," Kurt said. "Somebody has to ride shotgun on an operation like this. By the looks of it, our 2 friends have split up, taking the place of these 2. They're each in a different truck."
"Guarding the cargo and waiting for the drivers to arrive," Joe suggested.
"That's my guess. So now what?" "Stowaway time," Kurt said. "We get on board, they load up the other hackers, and hopefully take us right to Sienna."
What if Sienna is being held in Kim Jong-un's palace? Joe said.
Then we get a tour of North Korea, Kurt said.
Not sure I like that idea, Joe said. They don't have a lot of Mexican food up there, you know? Or much food in general, for that matter.
Kurt didn't exactly like the idea of ending up in the Hermit Kingdom himself, but he didn't think they were going there.
From what Colonel Lee said, the border is closed. Even if it were open, there's no way these guys were driving across the DMZ in a pair of big rigs with the Daishan logos splashed all over them. That makes sense, Joe said. I'd still rather call in the cavalry. We stop these guys on this side of the border, we'll never find Sienna, Kurt said. I didn't come this far to show my hand before the final deal, but if you want to stay here, I understand. Joe shook his head and with a grunt pulled off the goatee, completing his transformation from Solano back to Zabala. And go back to the party upstairs? I don't think so. But if we're not going into the so-called Democratic Republic of North Korea, then where are we going? Colonel Lee said the cyber attacks weren't directly traceable to North Korea, even though they're fairly certain North Korea was behind them. He said this Unit 121 had people working all over the world, in China, Japan, hidden here in Seoul. If that's the case, then we might not even leave the city. Joe broke into a grin. I like the way you think, he said. I'm sure you'll turn out to be wrong as usual, but there's something to be said for remaining positive until all hope is actually lost.
Kurt glanced back at the dead men, blood already oozing out from under the bodies.
That tarp won't hide him for long, he said, which means our friends can't play imposter for any extended length of time. Whatever they're going to do, it's going to happen quick. Okay, let's go, Joe said. But if we end up on the docks at Incheon or getting loaded onto a 747, I'm definitely calling in the cavalry.
Deal, Kurt said. As Joe covered the bodies once more, Kurt eased the door open and moved out of the stairwell. They stole into the garage as quietly as alley cats, making sure to stay out of the mirror's lines of sight. When they reached the back of the first trailer, Kurt unlatched the door and waved Joe inside. As soon as Joe was up, Kurt climbed in and closed the door gently. By the time Kurt turned around, Joe had his phone out, using the light from the screen as Kurt had done in the crawl space. He was examining the cargo. Computers, Joe said. High-tech servers by the look of things. I've seen racks of equipment like this in Hiram's data center. We're in the right place, Kurt said. This cargo must be destined for the North Korean cyber force. They settled in, sitting down and leaning against the wall of the truck, hidden by a large stack of equipment in case anyone opened the door for a quick look. A short time later, the sounds of activity picked up outside the vehicle. Loud voices speaking Korean were interspersed with directions in broken English. Shortly thereafter, the big rig shuddered as the engine came to life and the truck began to move. They seemed to inch their way through the garage slowly before climbing a ramp and then accelerating. After several turns that felt like they were negotiating city blocks, the truck began to pick up speed. Kurt pulled out his phone, found he had a strong signal, and switched it to map mode. It took a moment to locate his whereabouts and calculate his direction and speed, but soon there was a little blue dot on the moving map. Where are we headed? Joe asked. You don't want to know, he replied. To Kurt's chagrin, they were on the main highway, moving due north, heading directly toward the DMZ. Chapter 36. Sebastian Brevard sat on the veranda of his sprawling Baroque palace, overlooking the Olympic-sized swimming pool where he swam most mornings, as a servant delivered his breakfast of crepes and fresh fruit. After deeming the meal acceptable, Sebastian waved the servant away, only to have Laurent appear seconds later. I assume you have news? Sebastian said. Callista reports the infiltration plan is underway, Laurent said. Egan is with her. As planned, Sebastian thought. Make sure the extraction team is ready to pull her out as soon as she signals us. Already done. What about the others? Preparing to eliminate Acosta. Excellent, Sebastian said, grinning. I only regret that I won't be there to see his fat face when they dump him into the sea. Yes, it would have been nice to take him ourselves,
Laurent said. "Make sure there is no evidence," he said. "It will serve us well if the rest of the world thinks he's still alive."
"I've already given that order,"
Laurent said. Sebastian took a sip of fresh papaya juice and gazed out over the shimmering pool to the sprawling hedge maze that covered 10 acres on a lower level of the property. His grandfather had built the house and the surrounding walls. Sebastian's father had brought in the flowering plants and built the maze. "A reminder," he often had said, "that those who don't know the path are liable to get lost." Brevard knew the path he must take. Much as his great-grandfather had done, Sebastian intended to complete the job of a lifetime and disappear. In some ways, he hated to leave the family home, but it was the only path that led to a future. To keep the treasure he planned to take, the world would have to be fooled into thinking nothing had been stolen in the first place. To survive, if they ever figured it out, required a second trick: misdirection. He would convince the world that they'd killed him and ended the threat. And for good measure, he'd point the finger at someone else if they needed a scapegoat to hang. In that role, he would cast his unstable little sister and her ex-lover Acosta. They would play it perfectly. He considered her fate for a moment, wondered if he should feel some sense of guilt, and then dismissed the idea as if it were absurd. Much like the family home, she would soon outlive her usefulness. Dismissing Laurent, Sebastian opened a laptop beside him and tapped a few keys. Callista had set it up to monitor activity of the Numa crew to their south, the ones investigating the wreck of the Ethernet. According to the latest report, they were in the same vicinity, now getting assistance from a South African tug and setting up a salvage effort on a derelict they'd discovered. Curious, he tapped a few keys and was able to retrieve from the Numa database several photos of the ship. To his surprise, it was covered in foliage and tawny-colored soil. He scrolled down until he found a designation. The discovery all but sent him into shock. The salvage claim listed the derelict's name as the SS Waratah. He put down the slice of orange he was chewing on and wiped his mouth with a napkin, scanning the Numa file for more information on the ship. Her dimensions matched. The photos taken in several parts of the ship depicted old equipment and fittings. A picture of serving trays with the blue anchor logo in the middle were unmistakable, and an off-colored image of the ship's bell with the name and the ship's launch date engraved on it left no doubt. "Damn," he said, tossing the napkin down. Brevard felt his throat constricting. It was as if unseen hands were reaching out from beyond the grave to choke him and to pay him back for his family's treachery 100 years before. As he scanned the remaining details on the file, he recalled his father telling him the story. A story passed down from one patriarch to the next through 4 generations. It was a lesson about pain and danger, a tale of escaping death and passing it on to others, so the Brevard family might be preserved. He knew of his family's escape from South Africa with the wolves of the Durban police on their heels. He remembered hearing over and over again how it was only ruthlessness that had saved the family, how shortly after the hijacking the crew tried valiantly to take the ship back, how they'd been thwarted because his great-grandfather had expected it and had taken hostages whom he was willing to kill. In the aftermath of the uprising, the passengers and most of the crew were put off the ship in the lifeboats, leaving only 2 double-enders for launches and 20 crewmen behind to run the ship itself, a far more manageable number. As fate would have it, a storm had come up the next day, a storm so powerful the Waratah was almost capsized, just as the newspapers thought she had been. It seemed impossible that any of the lifeboats survived that gale, and as it turned out, not one ever made it to shore. The Waratah, on the other hand, was driven north, where, aided by the storm surge, she traveled up the narrow river farther than anyone could have expected. She ran aground in a meander that couldn't be seen from the coast in an unpopulated section of the country. It was there, that the last members of the crew were killed. Over the years, the ship seemed to burrow itself into the silt, sinking lower and lower, and soon being enveloped and completely covered. Sebastian's father had shown him the hill beneath which the ship sat, and years later he'd seen part of the ship itself after a woman the Brevard family was holding had inadvertently discovered the ship and tried to escape, along with 2 of her children, using one of the ship's remaining dilapidated boats. To everyone's surprise, the wooden launch actually stayed afloat long enough to reach the African coast. But the woman and her children had died from exposure long before they reached safety. Sebastian had always considered it poetic. They were in some ways the last victims of a doomed ship. But the superstitious part of him now wondered if this ancient ship could somehow be in the process of evening the score.
How is this possible?
Sebastian whispered to no one. He could only conclude that the torrential rains of the month prior had somehow unearthed the ship and pushed her out into the channel, and from there the current had taken her south, right into the path of the Numa team. But how had she remained afloat? How had she not broken apart and sunk to the watery grave long rumored to be her home after 100 years of rotting away? Whatever the reason, it seemed karma, the random nature of the universe, had dealt him a terrible card at the very moment he was getting ready to play his hand. He didn't know what evidence of his great-grandfather's actions might remain on the Waratah, but it was possible that clues left on that ship would reveal the family's treachery, or even lead the world to his door before he was ready to entertain them. He called for Laurent and waited. He had to speak carefully. No one else knew the secret of the lost ship. Not even the other family members. "What do you need, brother?" Laurent asked upon returning to the veranda. "Gather up your pilots and get the helicopters ready," he said. "It's time to attack our friends at Numa once again, before they become too complacent."
You want us to attack them from the air?
Laurent asked.
I thought you and Callista had already sabotaged them with the computers.
"We did," Brevard said. "But instead of being towed into port, they've remained on station and even found themselves a derelict to salvage. They're proving more resourceful and persistent than I care to allow. I need them distracted further. At this moment, with their salvage operation underway, they seem to have made themselves vulnerable."
We have a few torpedoes in the armory, Laurent said. Acosta was going to sell them to the Somalis before he betrayed us.
"Perfect," Brevard said. "Arm the helicopters with those torpedoes. I want that derelict sent to the bottom. And while you're at it, make a few strafing runs over the other ships in their little fleet."
You want us to attack the derelict?
Laurent said, sounding confused. Sebastian stared. He could understand why the order sounded odd. "Don't question me," he growled. "Just do as I order. Trust me, I have my reasons." Laurent held up his hands in an act of contrition.
I'm sorry, he said. I just wanted to make sure I understood.
"How soon can you launch?" Sebastian asked.
Within a few hours.
"Excellent," Sebastian said. As Laurent disappeared, Brevard turned back to his breakfast, but found he'd lost his appetite. The last thing he needed was to be exposed before he was ready to move.
End of CD 7. CD 8.
Chapter 37. Kurt and Joe rode in the back of Tan Rong's tractor trailer as it cruised along South Korean Highway Route 3. Through the wonders of modern technology, Kurt could track their progress on his phone.
Still heading for the DMZ?
Joe asked. Like a homing pigeon, Kurt said. 45 miles from Seoul, and no more than a mile from the edge of the DMZ, they felt the truck gear down. A series of twists and turns made it feel as if they'd gone off the highway. At the same time, Kurt's reception went out and didn't come back. Wherever they were, it was beyond the range of the cell phone towers. He put the phone away and glanced over at Joe. "You can forget about calling the cavalry. We've lost our signal."
"Great,"
Joe muttered. Kurt eased from his spot and crawled to the far wall where a pinprick of light was coming through a hole in the truck's metal skin. He cozied up to it and stared through.
Any sign saying welcome to North Korea?
Joe asked.
Not yet, Kurt said. Mostly bright lights and a rather funky smell.
Joe smelled it too.
It smells like
garbage, Kurt said.
We're driving into a giant landfill. I see overhead lights and dump trucks and bulldozers mashing everything down. Looks like half of Seoul's trash is out there. One of Tan Rang's companies,
Joe said, remembering the briefing.
Kurt nodded. You know what they say, where there's muck, there's brass.
Brass?
Coins, Kurt explained. Dinero, big bucks.
Right, Joe replied.
Let's hope that where there's muck, there's computer experts. Better here than across the border, Kurt added, agreeing with his friend.
The truck rumbled along, moving slower with each passing moment, eventually lurching to a stop with a hiss of the brakes. From Joe's perspective, the glare from the arc lights illuminating the landfill was suddenly cut off.
We've pulled inside a shed of some kind, maybe a loading bay.
Kurt stretched and made sure he was ready for action as the truck rumbled to a stop for the second time. He got in position behind a stack of computer parts and made sure he couldn't be seen from the rear door of the trailer. Joe did the same. They waited in the darkness, listening to voices speaking Korean, until the sound of a heavy mechanical gearing drowned them out. Almost immediately, Kurt felt the truck moving. Not forward or backward, but descending.
Why am I getting a sinking feeling?
Joe whispered.
Because we are, Kurt said.
The rate of descent picked up and then seemed to ease, but Kurt knew that was an illusion. Like the feeling of being motionless in an airplane when one is actually moving at 600 miles per hour. They were still dropping, but at a constant rate. Their bodies had just grown used to it. He glanced at his watch and noted the second hand moving past 12. It made it all the way around once, and had almost reached the 6 o'clock position when the descent finally slowed and stopped.
90 seconds, he whispered. How fast do you think we were moving?
Not all that fast,
Joe said. Maybe 2 or 3 feet per second?
Kurt made a quick calculation.
That puts us somewhere around 200 feet below the surface.
After the smooth ride down, the next move was a jolt as a large crane grabbed the shipping container and lifted it off the back of the truck. Kurt looked out through the pinhole and gave Joe the play-by-play.
A big overhead crane has us by the look of things. Appears to be moving us to some kind of platform.
They began to pivot as the crane operator manipulated them into a proper alignment.
I can see the other truck, Kurt said, and Callista. She's headed for what I'd guess is the control room.
Kurt watched her rap on the door of the control room and wait for the door to be opened.
Don't do it,
he whispered. No one heard his psychic warning. The lock was released and the door pushed open. She handed the first guard some type of manifest, and as he looked at it, she calmly drew her gun and opened fire. The shots were accurate, fired in rapid succession, but unhurried and without a sense of panic. She was cold and efficient. At almost the same instant, Callista's friend grabbed the other driver and broke his neck with a quick twist and a sickening crack. The two men came running from beside the crane to intervene, but were quickly gunned down. The room went still.
What about the other driver? Joe whispered. He's probably dead, Kurt suggested, figuring Callista would have killed him before she got out of the truck. This girl of yours is cold as ice, Joe said. She's not my girl, he said. Are they coming this way? No, Kurt said. They're going into the control room.
Unaware that she was being watched, Callista strode into the control room and immediately began working one of the computers. It took only 30 seconds for her to break into the system. Egan, her third brother, ducked in.
The loading platform is secured, he said. Does anyone know we're here?
I got them before they could sound the alarm,
Callista said. She ran through the security protocols and checked for any sign of trouble.
We're fine. Get the hackers out of the second van. We'll escort them through.
How many men on the other side? Egan asked.
A full 1,000,000 in the North Korean army,
she said with a smile. You know what I mean.
According to the duty roster I was able to pull up on the computer, the North Korean station is manned by 120. Most of them are restricted to the surface level and the topside loading zone. Only 40 are cleared to enter the lower levels, and they comprise 2 shifts, so we'll be dealing with no more than 20 at a time.
There are only 2 of us, he pointed out.
Makes it interesting, doesn't it?
He stared.
Relax,
she said, opening a pack with 3 silver canisters that had odd numeric markings on them.
This will even the odds.
Nerve gas?
Nothing so dangerous,
she explained.
It's an RPA, a rapid paralytic agent. Freezes the central nervous system for 10 minutes or so. It won't knock them out or kill them, but it will make them easy to hit. We take the main control room by surprise, then pump this through the station, and the rest will be easy.
Do we have gas masks? Callista produced 2 small filters that looked like bulkier versions of the masks surgeons wore. They fit over the nose and mouth.
We won't need them for long, she said. The gas goes inert after 60 seconds.
We still have to get through the tunnel first. At that moment, a message appeared on the screen. It was in Korean. Callista scanned it with a handheld device that translated it to English.
Our invitation, she said. They're awaiting transfer of the hackers. Get them out of the truck and into the tram.
What happens to them when we fire off the gas?
They get frozen in place, Callista replied, which will keep them from getting in the way.
Done asking questions, Egan left the control room as Callista made one last check of the system and patched command of the system to a remote unit she'd brought for just this purpose. From there, she made her way to a tram that sat at the entrance to a long tunnel. With an open top, it looked more like an ore car than the passenger tram so familiar to most airport travelers. She climbed in as Egan dragged the hackers from the rear of the second truck. Zeno 9x9, Z-Sum-G, and Montresor were powerful men in the underworld of computing, but were less than magnificent to behold in real life. 3 scrawny, scruffy-looking specimens. Their faces were pale, their eyes sunken, and their arms and legs thin and spindly. There seemed little about them to suggest danger or the ability to bring down nations all around the world. Not one of them had offered any resistance since their capture, though that probably had more to do with the sisters' wives and children being held at the Brevard compound than any sort of docile natures.
Get in,
she growled. They climbed onto a tram that rested just in front of the platform on which the first trailer had been deposited. With Egan in front, Callista took the rear seat, keeping the hackers between them. By typing a code into the remote, she activated the equipment, and the sound of a powerful generator spooling up reached everyone's ears. When a light flashed green on the remote, she pressed the go switch, and the tram began to accelerate down the long, lighted tunnel. Chapter 38. They're gone, Kurt said. They took off down some tunnel. Now's our chance. He made his way to the door and unlatched the panel on the back of the trailer. Hopping out, he took a quick look around. There were only dead men left in the control room. Dead men and blinking computers that Callista had tampered with. If he guessed right, anyone watching the room from a remote location would get nothing but a report that said situation normal. We'd better arm ourselves, he suggested, grabbing a pistol from one of the dead men. Joe crouched by one of the other bodies and did the same. Then they left the control room to take a quick look around. The space was huge, the size of an aircraft hangar. On one side, the big rig that had hauled them sat alone on an octagonal platform. Stripped of the container that had once been on its back, it looked small, out of place. Reminds me of a turntable in the railroad yard, Joe said. Kurt agreed. He looked up. An empty shaft matching the dimensions and shape of the platform ran upward into the darkness. The walls of the shaft were notched,
and huge wheeled gears that must have intersected these notches sprouted from 4 of the platform's 8 sides.
I guess those gears move it up and down, Joe said. Like an incline railway, only vertical.
Kurt had to agree. That explains how we got down here, but it doesn't explain why. Looking for the answer to that question, he moved to the horizontal tunnel, the one Callista and her friend had vanished down on a silent tram. It seemed to run on to infinity, colored in bands of white and gray where the overhead lights and the shadows between them alternated.
What do you make of all this? Joe asked.
I'm not sure, Kurt admitted, but I'm getting the idea that Tan Rong isn't quite as neutral as Colonel Lee and the CIA seem to believe.
You think this tunnel goes under the DMZ?
It's the only conclusion that makes any sense, Kurt said. For one thing, we're right up against the border. For another, the North has been digging tunnels under the DMZ for years. I can't remember how many have been found, but there are at least 3 or 4 major ones. Most were smaller and designed for infiltration, but supposedly the largest of them was capable of handling a division of men and light equipment in an hour or so. From the pictures I've seen, even that has nothing on this place.
Joe nodded. I thought the South was always listening for signs of more tunneling. Shouldn't they have heard this thing being excavated?
We're directly under a landfill, Kurt pointed out, with all those bulldozers moving around, not to mention the cranes, the dump trucks, and the compacting equipment. This place is a constant source of noise. I'm guessing that any stray sounds detected from this area could easily be written off as coming from the landfill. Beyond that, we're down here pretty deep. That has a tendency to muffle noise as well.
Gotta hand it to 'em. The landfill's a perfect cover. Even gives them a place to hide all the dirt and rock they had to excavate.
Kurt nodded, but didn't reply. He was gazing down the long tunnel and had caught sight of movement. There was no sound like a subway train screeching down the rails, but something was definitely headed their way.
Take cover, Kurt said.
He and Joe crouched down and readied their guns as the approaching target continued to race toward them. It had no wheels or cables. It simply seemed to be flying.
Maglev,
Joe said, using the short term for magnetic levitation.
That explains the high-voltage generators.
Another way to keep the operation quiet, Kurt said. It's almost silent. The car slowed rapidly the last 100 yards and was almost motionless as it exited the tunnel and slid onto a platform similar to the one their shipping container now rested on. As the sound of the humming generator waned, the new arrival dropped several inches, settling onto the platform with a surprisingly dull thud. Kurt waited, but no one came out.
Empty car?
Joe guessed. Suspicious of the whole scenario, Kurt crept up to the square cart and looked over the edge.
No passengers, he said.
But it's not empty. He reached inside and scooped up a handful of the cargo.
Pellets, he said.
Extremely light. Joe took a quick look, rubbing one of the pellets between his fingers.
Titanium, he said. Not fully processed yet, but halfway there.
I think I get it now, Kurt said.
Get what?
Tan Rong's played out mines that are producing 3 times what they did a decade before. His alliance with the shadowy figures in the north. He's salting his own mines, Kurt said. The generals send him half-processed titanium that he ships to a processor as if they came from his own mine, and he sends them computer hackers, high-tech supplies, and probably a steady diet of cold hard cash in return. The North Koreans get technology and access to markets the UN sanctions prevent them from touching, and Tan Rong gets cheap ore at fire sale prices. As if in response to the arrival of the ore-bearing car, a series of yellow lights began to flash around the base of the platform on which the shipping container had been placed, the one Kurt and Joe had been riding in with the high-tech servers.
Last train to Clarksville, Kurt said. Let's make sure we're on it.
He and Joe dashed for the open door of the shipping container, jumping inside just as the platform levitated upward. Kurt pulled the door shut and the container began to accelerate rapidly and smoothly. In seconds, they were moving 50 miles an hour, all without the slightest sound of machinery or even the grind of wheels on the road.
Since we seem to be on the express train here, Joe began. "I should probably ask what we're going to do when we get to the other side." "I guess we'll either be entering a dead zone or an all-out firefight," Kurt said. "We could have waited for them to come back." "What if they plan to take another way out?" "Well, you got me there," Joe said. It wasn't long before the big container began to slow. As it settled onto the receiving platform at the far end, it became clear there was no firefight in progress. A minute of silence rang in their ears before Kurt dared crack the rear door open. A quick look revealed several dead soldiers in North Korean uniforms and no sign of fighting or alarms in sight. Kurt and Joe hopped out of the container and did a quick survey. 9 men down, no sign of reinforcements. Ruthless and precise. Oddly enough, the 3 hackers lay on their sides in the tram they'd come over in. They were not moving, but didn't appear to have been shot. Joe shook one of them, but got no response. "They look drugged to me," he said. "They're still breathing." "We can figure that out later." They followed the trail of bodies to a corridor where they found an elevator. Joe was about to press the button when Kurt blocked his hand. "Let's not announce our arrival." They pried the doors open and found a narrow elevator shaft. On the far side, a maintenance ladder traveled up a shallow recessed channel that was carved into the wall. Kurt counted 5 floors between them and the underside of the parked elevator car. "What do you bet that's where our friends are?" Kurt asked. "Sounds like a place to start. We can't search this whole complex." They moved into the elevator shaft and began climbing the ladder. Kurt went first. Joe braced the door to keep it open. It gave them a little light to work with and would make for a quicker getaway if they had to come down the ladder as well. Climbing quickly, they passed the first 2 floors. As they cleared the third, Kurt heard a clink beneath them and then a dull metallic clatter as something fell down the shaft to the concrete below. He looked down and saw Joe, holding on for dear life with one hand and clinging to a broken part of the ladder with another. "What are you doing?" Joe hooked the broken section of the ladder onto one of the rungs and climbed past it. "We're in a lot of danger here, Kurt." "I don't think anyone heard that." "I'm not worried about the guards," Joe said. "I'm worried about North Korean construction practices. Have you looked at this concrete? It's flaking away like a day-old croissant. I'm thinking they use way too much sand. And this rebar, it's all rusted and loose." As if to emphasize the point, Joe pulled on one of the bars and it came right out. "I say we make this quick before the whole place caves in on us." Kurt smiled. His friend was an engineer and a perfectionist. He would never allow such shoddy work on his watch. "I'll be sure to send a strongly worded letter to Kim Jong-un when we get home," Kurt said. "Please construct your secret bases with better materials so we don't get injured when infiltrating them. Otherwise, you'll be hearing from our lawyers." "I'm sure that'll spur him to action," Joe said. By now, they'd reached the elevator car. Kurt squeezed by it and climbed on top. He pried open the emergency escape panel and dropped in as quietly as possible. Joe followed. The door was already open. The equivalent of a hold switch was in the locked position. 2 more bodies lay in the hall, and for a moment the silence held. But as Kurt stepped forward, a commotion rang out at the far end, multiple gunshots, a stun grenade going off, and then return fire from the silenced pistols of Callista and her partner. Whatever trick had gotten them this far without resistance had apparently failed at the last moment. Alarms were now sounding throughout the complex. "So much for the peace and quiet," Joe said. "Come on," Kurt urged, running forward, headed straight for the sounds of the battle. Chapter 39. Pressing himself up against the wall beside an open door, Kurt heard another volley of gunfire, a shout of pain, and then a second explosion from a stun grenade. Glancing inside the room, he saw Callista lying on her side, blood streaming from her ear. Her friend was firing into a smoke-filled room when a bullet knocked him backward and a second shell hit him dead in the center of the chest. On the ground beside them lay Sienna Westgate. A spike of adrenaline surged through Kurt.
He could hardly believe his eyes. She was alive. Or at least she had been, but now... A trio of North Korean soldiers rushed through the smoke, and Kurt instinctively opened fire, dropping the first two quickly and winging the third, who dove back through the smoke to a position of relative safety. "Cover me!" Kurt shouted to Joe. Joe swung into position and unleashed a hail of bullets as Kurt crawled into the room, grabbed Sienna, and dragged her out. She groaned as he pulled her into the hallway. At least she was alive. As he pulled her around the corner, a new volley of return fire came from the depths of the room, peppering the door frame and the wall. Joe snapped off a few more shots, and the last soldier dashed through the smoke toward the rear of the room and out into a stairwell. "Something tells me he'll be back with the posse," Joe yelled. "Let's not wait around to meet them," Kurt said. "Get the elevator." As Joe ran off, Kurt began to pick Sienna up. "Kurt?" Her voice was husky, like someone whose throat was dry. "You okay?" Kurt asked. "Huh? What are you doing here?" She was clearly disoriented. "Long story," he said. "Can you walk?" She tried to stand, but fell. "My legs," she said. "I can't feel them." "Put your arm around me," he said. "We have to get out of here." Sienna did as Kurt asked, and he helped her down the hall to the waiting elevator. There, he leaned her against the wall and pointed to Joe. "Stay with him." "Why?" she asked. "Where are you going?" "To return a favor." Joe shot him a look. "Kurt, this place is going to be crawling with North Korean troops very shortly." "All the more reason," he said. Kurt let Sienna go and stepped out of the elevator. Joe flipped the hold switch back to operate and pressed the button. "I'll send the car back up once we're out." Kurt nodded and took off back down the hall. Sienna didn't take her eyes off him until the doors closed between them. The smoke from the firefight and the stun grenades had filled most of the hallway by now. The flashing lights of the fire and smoke alarm systems pulsed through the haze. Kurt found the room where the fight had taken place and discovered Callista beginning to wake up from what he guessed was a stun grenade that landed too close. He dropped down beside her and shook her. "Remember me?" Like Sienna, it took Callista a second to recognize him. When she did, she reached for her gun, which Kurt knocked out of her hand and across the floor. "You wouldn't kill your rescuer, would you?" She looked around. "Egan." "If you mean your date," Kurt said, "he's dead." The news brought little reaction from her. Kurt began to help her up. "Wait," she said. She pulled out a small silver canister. "Throw it in the stairwell. It'll give us a few minutes." He dragged her over to the door and cracked it open. The sound of feet pounding down the metal stairs told him the North Koreans were on the way. "Twist it up," she said, now standing on her own, "and don't breathe." He did as she directed and tossed the canister onto the landing. It skittered to the wall and began hissing as two high-pressure jets of gas burst forth. Kurt slammed the door and heard the sound of men falling in their tracks and tumbling down the stairs. "Don't worry, they're not dead," she said. "I'm more worried about us," he said. "Go." She began to move, lurching forward unsteadily, but Kurt wasn't about to get too close. "Down the hall," he ordered. With a wall to lean against, she made better progress, slamming her hand onto the elevator call button as soon as she reached it. The doors opened, and she fell inside. Kurt followed and stood on the opposite side of the car, the pistol in his hand. He punched the bottom button, and the elevator began a slow, creaky descent. She laughed. "You really are a white knight," she said. "Can't resist a damsel in distress, even one like me." "Don't flatter yourself," he said. "You have answers, that's all I want from you. Who are you? Who are you working for? What do you want with Sienna and the others?" An exaggerated pout appeared on her lips. "I was hoping for something more than boring conversation." The elevator reached the bottom floor and the doors opened. Joe and Sienna stood at what appeared to be the control panel for the maglev train. To Kurt's surprise, the three hackers from the tram were awake and helping. "Can you work it?" Joe looked at Kurt and shook his head. "It's all Greek to us," he said, "and by that I mean Korean." Callista made her way over. "Maybe I can help." Kurt didn't trust her, but even she couldn't possibly want to stay where they were.
She studied the panel and flicked through a couple of screens.
They've cut the main power from up above. I can probably override their command.
As she fiddled with the controls, Kurt looked over a battery of closed-circuit TV feeds. One showed the hallway where the firefight had been. Another camera showed the stairwell. There seemed to be one on each floor. He checked through all of them. Men were piled like cordwood on each of the upper landings, but at the top level, a new group of soldiers were rushing in. They wore gas masks. "Better hurry,"
I think I've got it,
she said.
Get in the tram.
At her command, the three hackers began to move. Joe helped Sienna while Kurt stood by Callista, waiting for the inevitable trick.
Relax, she said. I'd rather spend time in a Western prison than a North Korean one.
She flipped a switch, and the power pack came to life. The hum of electricity and the whine of high-voltage generators were a welcome sound to everyone. "Get on board," Kurt said.
We need to transfer control to the remote,
she said, reaching into her pocket and grabbing for something. The act brought about a quick jab from Kurt's pistol.
It's just a remote control,
she said, pulling out a small device with a glowing screen.
We're going to need it, unless you want to stay behind and press go.
He snatched the device from her and pushed her toward the tram. As soon as they were all in it, he pressed the flashing green button. But instead of the tram accelerating, a lightning bolt flashed in Kurt's eyes and across the synapses of his brain. A wave of pain shot through his body, combined with the sensation of dropping from a great height. Aided by a push from Callista, he fell backward, tumbled over the side of the car, and was unconscious by the time he hit the ground.
I told you I'd be ready next time I saw you,
Callista whispered. Dumbfounded, Joe watched Kurt fall. There was no sound, no indication anything had happened. Kurt just dropping as if someone had turned off a switch in his brain. Sienna screamed, and Joe instinctively jumped out of the car and began to pull Kurt up. Kurt was dead weight, a 200-pound rag doll. Behind him, there was a commotion.
Sienna,
Callista said. It wasn't a shout, but a scolding, the way one might address an inattentive child. Joe turned around. Sienna was aiming a weapon at Callista. Good work, he thought. Callista obviously felt otherwise.
If you ever want to see your children again, you'll point that somewhere else.
Slowly, as if in a trance, Sienna turned the weapon on Joe. Not so good, Joe decided. Confident she was now in control, Callista addressed Joe directly.
Pick up the remote and toss it to me,
she said. Joe shook his head.
Please,
Sienna managed, tears pouring down her face.
She has my children. She has all our children. If we don't go back, they'll be killed.
We can rescue them, Joe insisted. She knows where they are. Just give us 24 hours. Sienna wavered, but Callista pressed her.
If I don't bring you back home alive, she began, none of your relatives will live to see the morning.
Sienna retargeted Joe, more firmly this time.
I'm sorry, she said. Tomorrow will be too late. Please, give me the transmitter.
Joe held still, but one of the hackers intervened, climbing awkwardly out of the tram car and grabbing the remote from the floor of the tunnel. As soon as he had it in his hand, the man climbed back in the car and gave it to Callista, who tapped the screen a few times and offered Joe a satisfied grin.
Au revoir,
she said, as the tram began to accelerate away.
Give your friend my love when he wakes up.
Joe watched the tram pick up speed and vanish into the gloom of the tunnel. I knew we should have called the cavalry. Hoping to wake Kurt, Joe shook him twice but got nothing. Kurt was catatonic, exactly the way he'd been when Joe pulled him from the water 3 months earlier. The parallel was eerie. And Joe began to think perhaps it was not entirely coincidental. This is bad, he said. It may have been the understatement of Joe's life. He was trapped in a secret base on the wrong side of the DMZ with an unconscious friend, a 9mm pistol carrying perhaps 5 shells in the clip, and an angry battalion of North Korean soldiers barreling down on them. Bad did not begin to cover it.
Chapter 40. With little time to waste, Joe eased Kurt to the ground and began to look around for options. First, he raced over to the panel and checked the security video once more. The feed showed more North Korean soldiers picking their way through the piles of unconscious men who'd made the initial descent. Counting up from where he was, Joe could see that the new troops in their gas masks had reached the 7th floor and would soon reach the 6th, where the battle had occurred. He guessed they would clear that floor and the ones beneath it first before making their way to the bottom, but time was not on his side. He studied the control panel, but it was an incomprehensible mess of Korean and flashing icons. No way he was going to be able to decipher that in time. He looked around, desperately seeking a mode of transportation that didn't require a physicist to operate. In the dark corner to his left, he saw something that might fit the bill. "Of course," he said. "The ore had to get down here somehow." There, sitting on a platform like the one in Tan Rang's underground base, was a big North Korean tractor-trailer. It was a bulk hauler with an open top, more like a dump truck than the modern intermodal shipping containers Tan Rang was using. Joe ran to the cab, climbed in, and was ecstatic to find the keys in the ignition. "Thank God for the internal combustion engine," he said, twisting the key and listening to the sweet sound of the rumbling diesel coming to life. Forcing it into the lowest gear, Joe managed to get the truck moving and eased it over to where Kurt lay on the floor. Stopping the truck and jumping out, Joe picked up his friend, carried him to the passenger's side, and hauled him onto the tattered vinyl of the old bench seat in the cab of the truck. As he settled, Kurt began to thrash around a bit, almost as if he was trying to swim. But then he slumped against the seat and went quiet once again. Joe climbed back into the cab on the driver's side and slammed the door. "Don't worry, amigo," he said, putting the truck in gear. "You just enjoy your power nap. I'll get us out of here. And when you wake up, we're going to have a long talk about the kind of women you rescue and the kind you leave behind, because clearly no one has explained the difference to you yet." As Joe spoke, he maneuvered the steering wheel and managed to get the behemoth of a truck pointed down the maglev tunnel toward freedom. Pressing the accelerator brought a roar from the engine and began filling the tunnel with thick black exhaust. The truck moved forward and was soon picking up speed. He hadn't gone too far when gunshots rang out from behind. From the cab of the rig, all Joe heard was the ping of ricochets bouncing off the thick walls of the truck bed and the boom of a tire exploding. Trying not to think about the danger, Joe kept his foot on the throttle and continued to gain speed. Between the unmuffled exhaust, the noise of the big engine reverberating off the walls, and the old chassis bouncing and shaking on its leaf springs, the ride back to the south could not have been more opposite from the smooth, quiet ride in on the maglev tram. Joe cycled through the gears, grinding every one of them. He began to laugh, enjoying the sound and the fury. It had to be 120 decibels or more. For the hell of it, he reached up and pulled the big rig's horn, which echoed down the tunnel as it blared. Soon enough, they were passing 40 and then 50 miles per hour. Ahead, Joe saw a problem. Every half mile or so in the tunnel was a choke point, where a reinforced concrete ring constricted the diameter of the tunnel. As he closed in on the first one, Joe was pretty confident the truck would fit. As it turned out, he was wrong. At 50 miles an hour, the metal top of the trailer clipped the roof, blasting chunks of concrete loose. It sounded like a bomb had gone off. The second choke point was even narrower, but Joe didn't slow down. More concrete was blasted free. This time a large section of the trailer's side was torn off, clanking to the floor and tumbling loudly across it. In the mirror, Joe saw the remnants of the twisted bed sticking out 2 feet to the side. It gave him an idea. Without slowing down, he eased over to the wall until the bent section of the truck bed was grinding against it, gouging a line in the wall, shedding sparks, and adding to the din. Eventually, the metal tore further until the whole side was ripped off and dragging behind the truck. Joe glanced at Kurt. "You must really be out cold if this isn't waking you up." Joe pulled on the horn lever once again and held it, letting it blare until his ears were hurting. Even then, he kept sounding it.
He wanted the world, and particularly the South Korean military, to know he was coming. The way Joe saw it, that was their only hope. 7 miles away, in a listening post manned by the South Korean military, a young private named Jong studied her monitors. The South Koreans had placed sound detection equipment all along the DMZ to listen for any possible underground incursion by the North. From time to time, they detected odd signals. Small earthquakes had been a problem, and the North Korean atomic bomb and other underground disturbances had sometimes triggered false readings. But nothing like what she was getting now. She called her supervisor over.
Listen to this.
He moved slowly, appearing unconcerned.
Something must be wrong with his system.
Private Jong shook her head.
I checked, sir. Plus, we're detecting the sound at several stations. That is not a sign of malfunction.
Let me hear it.
He plugged a headset into her console and listened as she turned up the sound.
Trucks, he said. Heavy trucks.
There was also a grinding noise that sounded like metal tank trucks. The computer agreed, assessing the vibration as multiple heavy vehicles moving at high speed. Suddenly alarmed, the supervisor picked up the phone and checked with a major in the post's operations bunker. He told the major what he was hearing and then received more disturbing news.
We are witnessing sudden frantic activity among North Korean units just on the other side of the DMZ. Where?
The coordinates relayed to him were alarming. North Korean units were on the move, near the very spot where the subterranean noise had originated.
Calculate its direction and speed, the supervisor ordered.
Already done,
Private Jong said.
Show me.
She tapped a button, and the signal's path appeared on the computer screen. It led straight from a suspected base in the north to a commercial site on the southern side of the DMZ.
What is that place?
The supervisor asked. Private Jong was checking.
Landfill,
she replied.
Daishan Landfill number 4.
The supervisor put 2 and 2 together. He could not believe what he was seeing. He called the major back and gave his assessment.
Confirmed large-scale subterranean incursion underway. Entry point must be in or around the Daishan landfill. Recommend defense condition 1. Immediate alert.
Racing beneath the DMZ, Joe had no idea what forces he'd set in motion, but he hoped it would mean a warm welcome instead of a firefight through a group of armed thugs loyal to Tan Rang. As he entered the last third of the passageway, the grade ramped up just a bit and the truck began to slow. Instead of the light at the end of the tunnel, he saw the darkness of Tan Rang's underground transportation center. There was no sign of any resistance awaiting him, nor were there South Korean soldiers, which for the moment was probably a good thing. It was a different story behind him. Vehicles were heading their way, catching up quickly. Based on the silence, he guessed they were running on the maglev system. As one of the trams raced up beside him, Joe spun the wheel to the right and knocked the tram off the center line of its magnetic track. Deprived of its support, the tram crashed to the ground amid a shower of sparks. Gunshots rang out from the second vehicle that was also closing in from directly behind. Once again, the bulk of the big truck protected them. This time, Joe simply stomped on the brakes. The big rig skidded to a stop amid a shriek of squealing tires and a cloud of blue smoke. Unable to adjust its speed as quickly, the second tram rear-ended the truck with jarring impact. Their pursuers now successfully dealt with, Joe put the truck back in gear and began to accelerate, working through the gears and heading into the home stretch. The truck labored on the slight upward grade and chugged into the loading bay at the end of the tunnel, bumping the ore car filled with the titanium pellets, which dumped out and spread all across the floor. As the sound of 1,000 marbles rolling in all directions ceased, Joe peeked out of the truck. There was no one there to greet them. No angry brutes with drawn weapons. No sign of Callista and the hackers. And still no soldiers. Joe looked back down the tunnel. The North Koreans had given up the chase. He could see them running the other way. He guessed they were not interested in getting caught on the wrong side of the border. Joe looked over at Kurt. "We made it," he said. And just like the last time, you missed the whole thing. Joe considered looking for a stairwell, but was not interested in lugging Kurt up 20 flights. Instead, he drove over and parked next to the octagonal platform they'd originally descended on. He parked the truck, pulled Kurt from the passenger's side, and found the controls. With the flick of a switch, he engaged the power system and moved the control lever upward from the neutral position. The incline gearing came to life and began to turn, and the platform began to rise slowly. As they went up, Joe pulled out his phone, hoping he would get a signal before they reached the top. No such luck. In fact, the phone was acting weird, as if it was being jammed. When the slowly rising platform finally reached the surface, Joe found out why. 30 Korean soldiers were waiting for him with weapons drawn. Humvees with .50 caliber machine guns were arranged in a semicircle around them. A spotlight snapped on, blinding Joe. Shouts that needed no translation told Joe to put up his hands, which he had already done. A pair of soldiers rushed over and forced him to his knees. "I'm an American," Joe said. To Joe's right, another soldier had a rifle aimed at Kurt. "He's injured," Joe shouted. "He needs a doctor." More shouts came his way. "We're American," Joe replied. "We're on your side. We're operating undercover for Colonel Lee of the National Intelligence Service." No response. "CIA!" Joe shouted, hoping they knew the acronym. With the spotlight on his face, they could clearly see that he was not Korean. A quick discussion was held, and Joe and Kurt were cuffed, thrown in the back of one of the Humvees, and driven off. As they pulled out of the warehouse, Joe got a first-hand look at the effectiveness of his plan. South Korean helicopters, armed with missiles and spotlights, were circling the landfill. Several others were patrolling down the line of the DMZ, looking for invading troops or infiltration units of the North Korean army. In addition to the helicopters, soldiers were everywhere. And as they took the road out, Joe saw Abrams tanks moving into position, while a flight of F-16s flashed overhead in full afterburner. Joe looked for the lights of Seoul, but the city had gone dark in response to the expected invasion. Joe whispered to himself. Maybe that plan of mine worked a little too well. They were taken to a military base and quickly separated. Kurt whisked off to the infirmary, Joe to an interrogation room. For 2 hours, Joe was subject to continuous interrogation by officers of the South Korean military. He told them all the same thing, and he asked repeatedly about Kurt. He got nowhere until Colonel Lee and Tim Hale arrived. They were livid. "You two must be insane," Hale said, "following them into North Korea." "We were following the lead," Joe said. "What did you want us to do? Just let them go?" "Maybe you should have," Hale said. "You know this will calm down," Joe said. "It's a minor incursion. And let's not forget who built the damn tunnel." "I wasn't talking about the political situation," Hale said. "I was referring to Kurt." "Why? What's happened?" Joe said, concerned. "He's in a coma," Hale explained. "The doctors can't say when or if he's going to come out of it." Chapter 41. Indian Ocean, 12:30 hours local time. 7,000 miles and 6 time zones from Korea, a small flotilla of ships was in the process of linking themselves together with heavy steel cables. Over the course of a day, 2 ocean-going tugs had arrived from South Africa. The Drakensberg had reached the Condor and towed it to where the Waratah lay drifting in the current, while a second tug, known as the Sedgwick, had arrived 6 hours later and was preparing to run lines to the foliage-encrusted hulk of the old ship. But before she could be put under tow, an inspection had to be made. At Paul's direction, a salvage crew had gone aboard, splitting into 3 groups. The main contingent began clearing the accumulated growth and sediment from the ship's hull, hoping to make her lighter in the water and less top-heavy. As they excavated up above, the Condor's chief engineer went down into the lower recesses of the ship to check the integrity of the hull and internal bulkheads.
As they worked on the inside, Duke and another diver were finishing up a survey of the hull's exterior below the waterline. The radio crackled at Paul's side. "Paul, this is the chief." Paul put the radio to his mouth. "What's the word?" "The engineering spaces are pretty gunked up. At least 2 feet of sludge down here, and in some places several feet of water." That didn't sound promising. "Can you find a leak?" "No leaks," the chief reported happily. "It's fresh water, rainwater if you want me to guess. Must be leaking in somewhere, but if you ask me, the hull itself is sound." "That's good news," Paul said. "What about corrosion?" "I think we're fine," the chief said. "To be honest, the old gal is in great condition for a ship that's past the century mark." "Any idea why?" Paul asked. "She should have rusted to pieces years ago." "I think it's the sediment," the chief said. "It's very dense, more like clay. It seals so tightly it blocks out most of the oxygen. Less oxygen means less rust. Less rust means a strong hull." "Sounds good," Paul said. He wondered how the exterior looked. "Duke, are you finished with your survey?" Duke's voice came back after a slight delay. "Affirmative," he said. "How's she looking below the waterline?" "The plating is in great shape," Duke replied. "If the chief is right, then I'd guess the exterior was sealed up with mud almost from the moment she went aground." Paul was glad to hear that. "Good news all around. Okay, if we head back to Condor for some lunch and dry clothes?" Duke had been in the water for 3 hours already. "You've earned it," Paul said. "Roger that. Duke out." Paul turned his attention back to the interior. "What do you think, Chief? Are we going to make it in?" Numa had plans to bring the Waratah into Durban 2 days hence. She wouldn't make Cape Town, her official destination when she'd vanished, but if she reached Durban, it would be a triumphant homecoming. "We have a good chance," the chief replied. "The only real danger is that she was obviously sitting aground somewhere for a long time. A ship isn't supposed to be out of the water and resting all its weight on the bottom like that. We can already see some deformity in the plating underneath." "Is that going to be a problem?" "I wouldn't want to ride out a storm on her," the chief said, "but if the weather stays nice, I think we'll be okay." "Good work," Paul said. "Check in with me when you get topside." "Wilco," the chief said. "Gonna recheck the stern and make sure we're not taking on water through the propeller shaft tube." Paul clipped the radio back on his belt, grabbed a shovel, and joined the crew in clearing the deck. Meanwhile, Game and Elena explored the interior of the ship, hoping to shed some light on the mystery. A dedicated search of the bridge, captain's quarters, and other official spaces gave little away. The logbooks were gone, along with the vast majority of personal possessions.
"Let's check the passenger cabins,"
Game suggested. Elena nodded and followed Game deeper into the ship. They descended the main stairway, encrusted with black mold and layers of gunk, arrived at the main passenger level, and entered a hall as dark as any mine shaft. With only their flashlights for illumination, the 2 women moved slowly. Down here, the musty odor was almost overpowering, as the floor, ceiling, and walls were covered in the same gunk as the stairwell. The sound of water dripping added to the cave-like atmosphere.
"Kinda creepy down here,"
Elena said.
"On that we agree,"
Game said. From above, they heard occasional clanging and the disembodied echo of the deck crew's voices as they shouted to one another, but they were muted and distant, like voices from the past.
"Do you believe in ghosts?"
Elena asked.
"No,"
Game said.
"And neither do you."
Elena chuckled.
"Well, if I did, this is where I'd expect to find one. All those people lost and never found? I've heard that angry spirits cling to the last place they were alive, haunting it, waiting for someone to find them and set them free."
With Elena going on about ghosts, Game felt the prickle of goosebumps on her skin.
"I'll take a ghost over another crocodile any day,"
she said. It took a while, but they'd soon checked through every one of the first-class cabins.
"Notice something?"
Game asked.
"No clothing, no luggage,"
Elena said.
"And no jewelry,"
Game said.
They'd been working on the theory that the ship ran aground somewhere and the passengers and crew died waiting for rescue. But the fact that they'd found only one of the ship's lifeboats suggested something else.
If they abandoned ship, Gamay said, they'd have had to leave their steamer trunks behind. But strands of pearls and diamond-studded bracelets are easier to carry. I'd bring mine, Elena agreed. But why leave a ship that was obviously not sinking? No idea, Gamay admitted as they made their way back to the main stairwell. Should we go down one more level? Elena asked. Gamay nodded. At the risk of sounding like my husband, let's keep going until we get to the bottom of this.
Down they went, checking the smaller cabins that lay on the next deck.
Crew stations,
Elena noted, studying the cramped cabin arrangements.
Or steerage, Gamay said. The Waratah was designed to carry a lot of immigrant passengers. Fortunately, she wasn't loaded to the gills when she left Durban.
They searched persistently, but beyond the everyday items from another century that would generate great historical interest, there was little to explain what might have happened. That began to change when Gamay forced open the next door. The space was larger, but no less cramped. Gamay offered a guess based on the look of the beds and storage cabinets.
Ship's infirmary.
She stepped into the compartment and went right. Elena fanned out to the left. They'd gone several paces when Elena let out a gasp. Gamay spun around and found Elena aiming her light at a skull with desiccated skin stretched across it, a tangle of wispy gray hair on top, and the bristles of what had once been a thick handlebar mustache on the upper lip. Another body rested beside it. Gamay crouched beside them for a closer look. The man wore a uniform.
He's a crewman, she said. Or at least he was.
A small badge seemed to indicate that he might have been a foreman in the engine room, perhaps in charge of keeping the boilers stoked. A hole in his shirt led to a hole in the torn and dried skin. Gamay began to get a sick feeling. The same feeling she'd had upon discovering the body on the Ethernet. She checked the other body. It was shirtless, and the skin was more decayed. She couldn't tell what had happened to this man, but as she stepped away, her foot hit a stainless steel tin resting beside him. Something clinked. Gamay picked up the tin, pried off the top, and dumped the objects out onto the palm of her hand. The first was flattened and mushroomed out at one end. The second was in relatively good shape.
Bullets,
Elena said. Gamay nodded.
Taken from these men, I'd bet, either to try and save them or after they died.
Without speaking another word, they finished their survey of the infirmary, discovering 3 additional bodies in the rear section, one of which was strapped to a bed. A clipboard with ancient yellowed paper still attached to it had fallen from the peg on the footboard. Gamay picked it up. She couldn't make out anything on the top sheet. The second page was in better shape. And as the light hit the paper at just the right angle, one small notation became readable.
Time of death,
she said. The hour was obscured, but the date next to it was legible.
August 1st, 1909.
The significance dawned on Elena quickly.
5 days after the Waratah went missing.
Gamay nodded. They'd found their first real clue.
We need to go tell Paul.
Paul was busy with the deck crew when Gamay and Elena came up to him.
We've found something,
Gamay told him breathlessly. Paul put his shovel aside as she began to explain, handing the mushroomed lead slugs to Paul as she finished. No passengers, no lifeboats, no logbooks, Paul whispered, going over the facts. But several crewmen dead in the sick bay, and at least one recovering from bullet wounds several days after the ship vanished.
Could there have possibly been a mutiny?
Elena asked.
This isn't the HMS Bounty, Gamay said. It was a cruise ship. No one here had been press-ganged into work. The sailors were professionals. Working on her was a fairly coveted job.
That left only one answer. Then it had to be piracy, Paul said.
Which would explain a great deal,
Gamay replied,
including our present location.
Paul nodded. They were over 300 miles northeast of the Waratah's last reported position. Given that the current in the Mozambique Channel flowed north to south and then around the Cape, she couldn't have drifted to their current location unless her resting place had been even farther up the coast, even farther from where she should have been.
To be honest, Paul said, I've been thinking it might have been piracy for a while. I can't come up with any other reason for her to wind up this far from where she should have been.
Gamay nodded.
But if you were a pirate and you'd just taken a large ship for a prize, the first thing you'd do is sail it in the opposite direction, out of the shipping lanes, away from where anyone would look.
Explains why the search and rescue vessels from the Royal Navy and the Blue Anchor Line never found her either, Paul said. They were looking in the wrong place.
Elena chimed in with a summation.
So a group of pirates board the ship, take control of her, and turn her north, knowing it will be days before a search even begins. By that time, the culprits can be hundreds of miles from the danger zone. Must have been easy to disappear back then,
Gamay noted.
Radios weren't in use on ships yet, and the airplane had only been invented 6 years prior, which meant they were few and far between and of relatively short range, certainly not suited for long missions out to sea looking for missing ships.
It was a different time, Paul said, even compared to 10 years later.
Paul found himself intrigued by the mystery, which seemed to grow deeper and more complex by the moment.
So where did she end up? He wondered aloud.
Considering the current in this section of the world, it could be anywhere from here to Somalia,
Elena said.
That's true, Gamay said, but I've come up with an idea how we might narrow it down. Strangely enough, it begins with taking a closer look at those spiders.
Paul raised an eyebrow.
You really are cured.
Only temporarily, she said. You still have to kill them for me at home.
I set them free out the back door, Paul said.
Gamay shook her head.
Of course you do.
So, what's the plan? He asked.
Before we toss all the foliage, insects, and debris over the side, we should take samples of everything. The seeds, the bugs, the spiders. We should even have someone examine what's left of our crocodilian friend before Elena turns him into a handbag. If we can determine what kind of plants and bugs we're dealing with, we might be able to use that information to narrow down where the ship has been all these years.
It sounded like a great idea to Paul. You're the expert and the gardener of the family, he said.
I'll help, Elena said, especially if it means I don't have to go down below again.
Paul laughed. I'll tell the crew to stop excavating until you two have collected your samples. I'm sure they'll enjoy the break.
Paul walked over to the deck crew and gave them the good news. He was getting ready to radio their findings to the Condor when the sound of a helicopter approaching became audible. Paul looked west, expecting to see the Condor's Jayhawk finally returning from Durban. But instead, the sound came from the north, where 2 black dots were descending from a higher altitude and coming directly toward them. They were staggered, with the first one perhaps a mile in front of its partner. Suspicious, Paul took out a pair of compact binoculars and focused on the nearest of the 2 craft. It was dark green in color, clearly military, and carrying ordnance in pods on either side. Flashes caught Paul's eye, like sunlight reflecting off the canopy. But it wasn't the sun. Ribbons of water flew up on a track toward the bow of the ship. The heavy thunking sound of .50 caliber shells tearing through metal followed.
Hit the deck,
Paul shouted, stepping away from the rail and diving behind the piles of dirt as if they were sandbags. The other crewmen dove to the ground around him, and Paul caught sight of Gamay and Elena racing his way.
What's happening?
Gamay shouted. The first helicopter thundered overhead, heading to the south and banking into a right-hand turn.
Not sure, Paul said, but I'm beginning to think someone doesn't like us very much.
He looked up and trained the binoculars on the second helicopter, coming in low and slow. It was over a mile away and less than 100 feet above the water when it released its payload. Paul had been on heightened alert since the incidents during the dive on the Ethernet, but even he needed a moment to process what he was seeing. The payloads were long and thin. They hit the water with tiny splashes and then vanished, leaving only thin trails of bubbles stretching out behind them to mark their course. It was clear to see that they were tracking straight for the Waratah.
"Torpedoes," he said.
Torpedoes?
Gamay sounded as shocked as he was.
"Coming right at us,"
he added, and then turned to the crew.
"Everyone off! Abandon ship!"
End of CD 8. CD 9.
Chapter 42. Paul's urgent warning reverberated across the deck. The crewmen, who had recently scrambled for cover, got back on their feet and charged toward the rope ladders that led to the launches below.
"Go!"
Paul said, helping people over the edge. "Quickly!" As they scampered down the ladders, Paul glanced around. The helicopters were swinging around, strafing the tugs first and then the Condor. At the same time, the torpedoes they dropped were tracking slowly inbound. The torpedoes were running toward the Waratah at just over 30 knots, and with a mile between them, it gave the crew nearly 2 full minutes to abandon ship and move out of harm's way. It was just slow enough that something extraordinary began to happen. In the distance, the red hull of the FRC flashed into the picture, racing at full speed and dropping in behind the charging torpedoes. Paul grabbed the radio.
"Duke, what on earth are you doing?"
"Intercepting the torpedoes," Duke replied. "Seems like an awful shame to let that old rust bucket go down now, especially when she's just recently returned from beyond like this." Paul watched as Elena went over the side and down the ladder. Gamay was next, but the chief was still down below.
"You're damn right it is," Paul said into the radio. "Do what you can."
Duke had been halfway back to the Condor when the helicopters appeared and launched their attack. He saw the strafing run and watched the torpedoes drop, realizing quickly that the Waratah, for whatever reason, was the target. Instead of continuing on toward the Condor, Duke had slammed the throttles forward and spun the FRC's wheel until it was tracking backward toward the old derelict. His first thought was that he might be needed to help get the crew off the ship, either before or after it was struck. But as the speedy little boat raced toward the hulk of the old liner, it quickly came across the trail of bubbles from one of the torpedoes, and in that moment, Duke came up with a different plan.
"Pull the guns out of the weapons locker," he shouted to the other divers.
Ahead of them, the broad flank of the Waratah loomed, growing larger in his sight with each passing second. But they were gaining rapidly on the second torpedo.
"Don't hit the warhead," Duke shouted to his gunners. "We'll be blown to pieces. Hit the prop or the motor or the fins. We just need to get it off course."
The men nodded and switched off the safeties on their weapons. They had only handguns to work with, but if Duke got them in close, it would be enough. Skipping across the surface at full speed, they came up alongside the torpedo. It was a light gray color beneath the water, running at a depth of 5 feet.
"Take it out!"
Duke shouted, matching the torpedo's speed. The divers began firing, drilling holes in the water with the Ruger pistols. Duke would have given a year's pay for a rifle, but 2 of the rifles were on the Waratah with Paul, and the rest were back on the Condor. Despite both weapons being emptied at the target, the torpedo continued on undeterred. It was no more than 30 seconds from impact.
"It's too deep," one of the gunners said.
"Reload!" Duke shouted. "I'm going to try something." He gunned the throttle and crossed in front of the torpedo and then back over it again. By the third pass, he could see the torpedo bucking up and down like a jet ski crossing the bow wave of a passing cabin cruiser. It nosed down and then came up, breaching the surface momentarily. At that moment, the divers opened fire, plunking the rear casing with several direct shots. Whatever they'd hit, the torpedo dove out of control, twisting to the right and spiraling down. Duke cut the wheel to the left and had covered 100 yards when there was a flash beneath the water. A concussion wave hit next, and a ball of white water erupted, blasting up into the air and raining down in a wide circle. "One down, one to go," Duke shouted, turning back to the right, looking for the other torpedo trail.
"It's too far ahead," one of the divers shouted.
"I'm not giving up," Duke insisted. But even as he got the FRC back on track, he could see it was too late. They were racing headlong toward the Waratah's stern. The space between them would be used up faster than they could hope to catch the fleeing torpedo. "Duke, peel off!" came a shout over the radio. "That's an order!" Duke followed the command and cut to the left as two streams of gunfire came from the deck of the old ship. Paul and Gamay were standing at the rail, firing down at the incoming torpedo with the two AR-15 rifles. At a range of 100 feet, one of them hit the warhead just right. A new shock wave erupted and a column of water exploded upward from the surface of the sea like a geyser. Heat and flame chased the water, burning some of it to steam in midair. Up on Waratah's deck, Paul and Gamay were thrown backward by the shock wave. They landed together amid a pile of weeds that the deck crew had yet to clear. Paul opened his eyes as mist from the torpedo's explosion drifted down on them. His ears were ringing. He glanced over at Gamay, saw that she was all right, and sighed with relief. "Pretty good shooting, if I do say so myself." Gamay propped herself up on one elbow and stared at him.
"How do you know it wasn't my shot that did the trick?"
"You were wide left," he said. "I could tell from the start. Wind correction."
"Those were your bullets going left,"
she insisted. Paul laughed and got to his feet. He looked around for the attacking helicopters, hoping they wouldn't make another run. Thankfully, they were heading back to the north. They left behind 2 patches of churning water, a smoking tug, and a bewildered group of people who wondered what could be so important about a derelict ship that someone would want to sink it. Paul found the radio that had been knocked from his belt. He picked it up and made sure it was working. "Thanks for the help, Duke. You must be half crazy, but it's much appreciated." "You're welcome, Paul. Sorry I couldn't get 'em both. Nice shooting, by the way." "Thanks," Paul and Gamay said in unison, and then glanced at each other. Duke signaled that he was heading back to the Condor, and Paul acknowledged the message before reaching out to the Condor. "Condor, this is Paul," he said. "I need a damage and casualty report." "Mostly cosmetic," the voice replied. 2 crew were injured by shrapnel. Another seems to have a nasty bump from diving into a bulkhead, but no major injuries or fatalities." "Sounds like we got off lucky," Paul replied. "Contact the tugs and get me a report. I see a lot of smoke coming from the Drakensberg." "Roger that," the crewman said. "And get in touch with HQ," Paul added. "We need some protection out here. I haven't the foggiest idea why someone would try to sink an old derelict like this, but there's no denying that's what they wanted to do. Until we figure out who they are and what they want, we can't put it past them to try again." As the Condor signed off, the chief called in from down below. "What the heck is going on up there?" "Believe it or not, we almost got torpedoed," Paul explained. "Torpedoed?" "I realize it makes no sense," Paul said. "Just trust me. It was close, but we seem to have survived intact." There was a long pause before the chief radioed back. "Maybe not," he said grimly. "The shockwave must have buckled the old plating. We've got water coming in down here." Chapter 43. The chief's message was grim news to Paul.
"We may have won the battle but lost the war,"
Gamay said, giving words to Paul's thoughts. "I'm going down below," Paul said, handing the radio to Gamay. "Get in touch with Condor and the tugs. We need pumps. We need divers with salvage gear. If there's a buckled plate, they can weld a patch over it."
"Are you crazy?" she said. "It's a miracle this ship is still afloat as it is."
"I can't explain," Paul said, "but I've grown attached to this ship, and I'm not giving up on the old gal yet. Not after all she's been through."
"Who are you?" Gamay asked. "And what have you done with my sensible New England husband?"
Paul gave her a quick kiss, took her flashlight, and ran for the stairs. He heard her calling over to the Condor as he raced down into the dark. 4 flights down, he could already hear the sound of water coming in. It was a powerful rushing noise, as if a fire hydrant had been busted wide open. As he reached the bottom landing, Paul's feet plunged calf-deep into water. "Chief, where are you?" he shouted.
"Aft bulkhead," a voice shouted from down the hall. "Hurry!" Paul charged toward the stern, past the boilers and coal bunkers to the old engine room. He saw light coming from a ladder well that descended into the aft bilge, which was the lowest section of the ship where all the bilge water collected. Beneath it lay only the cold sea. As Paul played his light around, he spotted water blasting in through a ruptured seam in the hull plating. It coursed through the compartment in an angry foaming stream before swirling down the ladder like it was a gigantic drain. The water level was rising with alarming speed. "We can't stop this," Paul said, suddenly shocked back to reality. "We have to get out of here." "I can't," the chief said. "I'm trapped." Paul saw nothing holding the chief in place. "What are you talking about?" "My legs are stuck in the sediment," the chief shouted. "The shock wave from the explosion liquefied the muck. When I dropped down here to take a look, I sunk knee-deep into it. It might as well be quicksand." Paul stepped onto the ladder, grabbed the chief's hand, and pulled with all his might. The chief remained stuck right where he was. Paul aimed the flashlight down into the water. The chief was indeed sunk up to his knees. Paul stepped down another rung as the water swirled around him and pounded his shoulders. Hanging on tight, he got into a position where he could use more leverage, grabbed under the chief's arm, and pulled again. It was no use. "Wiggle your feet." "I can't," the chief said. "It's like they're stuck in concrete." By now, the water was up to the chief's waist and rising fast. Paul stepped back. He needed something to dig the chief out with. Shining the light around, he caught sight of a metal pipe with a barbed end. It might have been a picker bar used by the firemen on the old ship to rake the coals with. It would have to do. He grabbed the picker bar, came back to the well, handed the chief his flashlight, and jabbed the bar into the sediment near the chief's legs. Shoveling it first and then stirring, he began to dislodge the muck. "It's working," the chief said. "Keep going." Paul could hardly see. He worked vigorously as the water reached the chief's chest and then his neck. The chief tilted his head to keep his nose and mouth above the water. Paul kept digging, and the chief began to come free, pulling on the rungs of the ladder and drawing himself up. One leg came free and then the other, minus a boot. The chief went up the ladder and Paul followed. The last 6 inches of the bilge filled rapidly, and soon the main engine room began flooding. Exhausted from the struggle, the two men stumbled for the bulkhead. By the time they reached it, water was pouring over the sill like a miniature version of Niagara Falls. "Think it'll hold?" Paul asked, looking at the 100-year-old version of a watertight door. "Only one way to find out." Paul grabbed the door and tried to force it shut, but a century of corrosion prevented it from moving much. Putting his shoulder into it, Paul managed to move it halfway to a closed position before it seized once again. Stepping back, he took the iron picker bar and banged on the hinges, trying to knock the corrosion off. A few flakes were all he managed to clear. Putting the bar down again, he and the chief got behind the door and leaned into it. It closed 3/4, and then almost flush. But the weight of the water pouring through was too much, and it pushed them back. "It's no use," the chief said. "One more try," Paul said. From the corner of his eye, he saw a figure come running down the stairs behind them. Some assistance at last. "Help us!" With the water surging through waist-high at this point, Paul leaned into the door one more time. He felt the chief pushing with all his might, and then felt a powerful shove from behind as the crewman who'd come to help reached them. Between the three of them, they overcame the force of the rushing water. The door clanged shut, and Paul wrenched the wheel over to lock it tight. The seal was less than perfect after all these years, and water sprayed through around the edges in several places, but it could be measured in gallons per minute. Pumps could handle that, at least as long as the door held. Paul collapsed onto the floor and looked at the chief, who was smiling from ear to ear. "Just another day at the office," the chief said. "Think I'm ready for a day off," Paul replied. He turned to thank the crewmen for coming to their aid, but there was no one there. He looked around in all directions, but even after grabbing the flashlight from the chief, he saw nothing but the dark hall. They were alone. Did you bring anyone else down here? Paul asked. The chief shook his head. Everyone else went topside before the attack. Why?
Paul gazed down the hall to the stairwell. He now realized that in the dark it would have been impossible for him to see someone standing there. But he distinctly remembered a broad-shouldered man with a mustache. He decided his mind was playing tricks on him.
No reason, he said finally. Just making sure. Let's get up top in case this door gives way.
Paul grabbed the picker bar, climbed to his feet, and helped the chief up off the deck. Wearily, they slogged their way toward the stairwell and climbed up into the daylight. In the hour that followed, pumps from the Condor and one of the tugs were brought in. The watertight doors were braced and reinforced inside the ship, while the salvage divers quickly found the ruptured seam and welded a patch job over it. The ship was still leaking, and it was anyone's guess if the hull would hold out, but as the tow got underway and the ships began to move, they did so under the watchful eye of the South African Air Force, which sent fighter aircraft and armed helicopters overhead in a series of revolving sweeps. As evening came on, the small flotilla met the first ship in what would prove to be a substantial honor guard. Within the hour, 2 additional warships joined it, followed by a dedicated repair vessel ready to lend a hand. It seemed that having endured the Waratah's loss once already, the South African government was determined not to let anything happen to her again. With a protective force around them, Paul began to feel more at ease. He found Gamay on deck, placing samples of many different things into plastic baggies, labeling them and zipping them shut. She had her hair tied back, a pencil behind one ear, and her most studious look firmly in place. Paul sat down beside her. Almost done?
With the collection part,
she said, placing the samples into a plastic cooler.
I'm flying back to Durban to meet with a biologist regarding these samples. Want to come?
I'd love to, Paul said, but I want to make sure this ship reaches port.
I'd say you've done enough,
Gamay replied.
But I've seen that look before.
The job is not done until it's done, he said.
I'll be there to see you arrive,
she said, placing the lid on the container and locking it down. He smiled, thinking back to all of the times one of them had waited on shore for the other to come home. It was always an enjoyable reunion. She stood and picked up the cooler. Paul grabbed a second cooler and they began walking to the stern, where a launch waited to whisk her over to the Condor and the military helicopter waiting to fly her to Durban.
Do you believe in ghosts? He asked.
She laughed at the question.
Not really. Why?
No reason, he said. Just checking.
They'd reached the ladder, where a crewman helped lower down the containers.
I'll be ready for that candlelight dinner by the time I make port, Paul said.
I'll make us a reservation,
she said. Paul hugged and kissed her, and then stood back as she climbed down the rope ladder to a waiting boat. As the launch peeled off and made for the Condor, Paul decided he was a man with a lot to look forward to over the next few days. Dinner with Gamay, bringing the Waratah into port after 105 years, and, if Gamay was right, some new insight into where the ship had been hiding all these years. Chapter 44. At the Brevard lair, the family mourned the passing of Egan with a somber ceremony, counterbalanced by the fact that Acosta the traitor had been killed and the hackers returned to their rightful owners. Without delay, Sebastian put them to work. Using their own skills and the offensive capabilities of Phalanx, they were soon hacking into the American Department of Defense, the European Air Traffic Control System, and various other entities, with the intention of wreaking havoc.
Is all this really necessary?
Callista asked.
We need a smokescreen for our true plans, he said. A little carnage will do nicely.
Callista nodded and walked to the front of the control room, where the floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the Olympic-sized swimming pool, a pool where she'd learned to dive, where she and the others had trained for the mission to attack the Ethernet. Thinking about that moment, her mind wandered to Kurt Austin. Since encountering him there, she'd hacked into the medical files Numa was keeping on him and learned of his relationship with Sienna. She wondered what would possess a man to risk life and limb for a woman he could never have, a woman whose rescue would only result in him losing her again, as he delivered her back to another man's arms. Either Sienna was the type of woman who inspired such love, or she was fortunate enough to have encountered a man whose sense of duty was more important than his own self-preservation. In either case, Callista found herself jealous. She had never known such a man, and probably never would.
"Get Laurent up here," Sebastian said, breaking her train of thought. "We need to make sure all his men are brought back to the compound and ready to fight, even the ones we've simply hired for local jobs."
Expecting company?
"Not right away," Sebastian said, "but soon enough. When they do come, we must be certain that they bleed. They must find it as difficult as possible to overcome our defenses, or they won't truly believe they've won."
She understood. It was all part of the game. Chapter 45. Durban, South Africa. Game arrived in Durban and found herself something of a local attraction. The discovery of the Waratah was being kept secret until the ship was brought safely into South African waters. But the rumor had begun to spread, and hearing that a member of the Numa team had been flown in with samples of something that she needed examined, she was met with an excited response. Several experts flew in on their own dime and convened with her at the University of Durban Westville campus. They quickly set up shop, examining the samples of the insects, dead rodents, and various seeds and plants discovered on the Waratah. While they worked, Game took the opportunity to visit the library and found a microfilm machine where she could peruse the old newspapers printed at the time of the Waratah's disappearance.
Are you sure you don't want to use a computer?
One of the librarians asked.
All of this is online. Thank you, but no, Game said. I've had quite enough of computers for a while.
Left alone, she read article after article. It was an education into a different time. She'd grown so used to today's world, where plane crashes and mishaps of any kind were covered live and the information distributed and verified almost instantly, that it was odd reading about the disappearance. Initially, the ship was just thought to be overdue, a common occurrence. Even days and weeks later, there were articles suggesting that the Waratah might yet arrive, or that the search vessels would encounter her and tow her in. Estimates of how long her food supplies would hold out were offered as reason not to panic. But then hope faded and the reality set in. Speculation and rumor began to run rampant. The storm of July 27th was considered the likely culprit. The statements of a man named Claude Sawyer became a focal point. He was the sole passenger bound for Cape Town who decided to disembark the ship in Durban. He sent a telegram to his wife that read, in part, "Thought Waratah top-heavy, landed Durban." Mr. Sawyer also claimed to have had a dream shortly before the ship reached Durban, in which a knight crying the ship's name came charging through the waves with a sword raised high. After getting off in Durban, he claimed to have had another dream in which the Waratah was swamped by a massive wave, capsized, and vanished from sight. A different theory was espoused by Captain Firth of the steamer Marare. He believed the Waratah too big and strong to be taken by a rogue wave, and thought it more likely that she'd lost a propeller or rudder and was adrift in the current, being slowly hauled past the Cape of Good Hope and out into the Atlantic Ocean. Firth was certain the Waratah would be found, much like a similar vessel, the SS Waikato, which broke a propeller shaft on the way to Auckland and drifted for 6 full weeks before eventually being discovered. Some speculated she would drift all the way to South America. As Game read the newspapers over, she found her attention turning to other stories of the day. News of the storm, political arguments, and ads for products, including one that touted smoking as a cure for the common cold. Most striking, she read a long dispatch about the Durban police battling a group of criminals known as the Clar River Gang. After an explosion and a conflagration that burned up a fortune in paper currency, it was finally determined that the notes were actually near-perfect forgeries.
While most of the Clar River gang had indeed perished, Robert Swan, chief inspector of the Durban police, feared the leaders had escaped and would resurface.
"May you live in interesting times,"
Gemma whispered to herself.
"Excuse me," a voice said from behind her. "Are you Gemma Trout?"
She turned to see a man wearing a navy blue suit and an open-neck button-down white shirt. He offered his hand.
"My name is Jacob Fredericks. I've heard a rumor that you might have discovered the SS Waratah. Is that true?"
Gemma hesitated.
"I worked with Numa on an expedition looking for the ship years ago," the man explained. "Unfortunately, we came up empty."
She recalled the name, and though she wasn't sure if this man was who he said he was, she doubted there was much danger to her or the ship anymore. As the truth was obviously leaking out from several sources, she decided to tell him what she knew. They spent the next 2 hours discussing the ship's vanishing, and the time Fredericks thought he'd found it, only to learn he'd discovered a World War II cargo ship torpedoed by the Germans.
"I'm almost relieved to know the ship has been beached somewhere all this time," he told her. "Makes not finding her on the bottom a little easier to take."
Gemma smiled and told him about the incidents that had occurred since the discovery. Frederick seemed surprised by what he heard, but mentioned that odd theories and occurrences had always surrounded the ship.
"A psychic once held that they'd made land and started a new civilization," he explained.
"Closer to the truth than we might have guessed,"
Gemma said, though it was pretty clear that the passengers never made land.
"One of the strangest stories took place in 1987, he said.
"When you thought you'd found the wreck?"
she asked.
"No, that was years later," he said. "Back in 87, an old double-ended lifeboat was found adrift off the coast of Maputo Bay, Mozambique, by some fisherman, if I recall. There were 3 people in it, a woman and 2 boys. The woman had a slight bullet wound, but it was not fatal. Unfortunately, dehydration was, for all 3 of them. They were identified as part of a family that had been abducted years before. Authorities thought they'd escaped from somewhere up the coast. Somalia was the prime suspect. It was a pretty lawless place even back then."
"Sounds terrible," she said. "But what does that have to do with the Waratah?"
"The old lifeboat they were in was rotted half to the core. It had been hastily patched and sealed with household items and wouldn't have lasted much longer had it not been found. Several experts insisted it was a design used and built from 1904 to 1939. Years later, someone did a computer analysis of the photos taken then and claimed to discover the remnants of lettering still visible on the highest plank, basically because the layers of paint had limited the erosion. I truly can't remember how they did it, but in the photo the writing could have been interpreted to spell Waratah."
Gemma sat back, stunned.
"You're joking."
He shook his head. "At the time, everyone assumed it was a hoax, like that alien autopsy video. But now, after what you've found, there is a possibility it might be true." "And then there was the Clar River gang," he said, moving on to a new subject.
"I was just reading about them," she said.
"Some think they bribed their way aboard the ship," he told her.
"Really?"
"Yes, and then drowned when it went down."
"Except that it didn't go down,"
Gemma noted.
"Could this gang have hijacked the ship?"
"From what I've read, they were ruthless," he told her. "If the ship was taken over, they would have been just the kind of people to do it."
Gemma found her mind swirling. She wanted to investigate everything this man had told her. But before she could do anything, her phone buzzed. A text message requested that she return to the laboratory where the samples were being analyzed.
"I have to go," she said. "I would love to talk more when I have some time."
"Anything for Numa," he said, handing her a business card and shaking her hand. Gemma left the library and returned quickly to the lab. The biologist who'd led the team summarized the results.
"Have you been able to give us some idea of where the ship might have been?" she asked.
"You're in luck, Ms. Trout," the biologist told her. "You've found several species that exist in only one place on Earth."
He showed her the skeleton of a small animal that one of Paul's deckhands had dug up during the excavation. She thought it looked unique when she was putting the remains in the plastic case.
"What is it?"
she asked.
A fossa, he said, showing her a picture of the animal.
It looks like a cross between a cat and a kangaroo,
she said, looking at the picture. It's actually a type of mongoose, he replied. Next, he showed her a large moth. It had just been emerging from a cocoon when Elena had spotted it. Neither of them could believe how large it was. This is a moon moth, the biologist said before moving over to the spiders they'd found on the first night. Golden orb weaver spider, he explained. Well, there are many species like this around the world. What we found in its web is unique. He pointed to an insect, one that had been wrapped up in spider silk. Giraffe weevil, he explained, handing her a magnifying glass. She focused her vision. The little bug looked fairly normal, except for a long skinny neck and head that stuck out from its body like an extension attachment on a vacuum cleaner. She couldn't believe they'd gotten so lucky. She figured the bad news was coming next.
Let me guess. Somalia?
No, he said, much closer. The west coast of Madagascar.
Madagascar?
She repeated. He nodded. You see, the island of Madagascar broke off from Africa 160 million years ago, he explained. India was still attached to it at the time. But 80 million years ago, India itself was torn loose by plate tectonics. As the three landmasses were pulled farther and farther apart, animals and plants left on Madagascar evolved differently from those in the rest of the world. As with Australia, there are hundreds of species that call only Madagascar home. You've discovered 3 of them on your floating wreck, which tells us it was parked there for quite a while before it floated back out to sea.
And the crocodile?
She asked. Plenty of them in Madagascar, he said. Gamay nodded. The evidence was clear. The Waratah had spent her time aground on the western shores of Madagascar. The only questions now were where and why someone was interested in sinking her. Chapter 46. Kurt Austin felt himself falling, dropping weightless into the darkness, his nerves tingling at the sensation. He plunged into the water, and the cold sting opened his eyes. Suddenly, he could see. Murky blue surrounded him, but there was light up above, and the strange sight of waves toppling from beneath as they rolled over him. He kicked for the surface and came out into a storm. Wind-driven rain lashed the sea, and swells the size of railroad cars buoyed him up and then dropped him down once again. The yacht, the Ethernet, was ahead of him. Sienna and her family were on it. He kicked toward it and pulled himself aboard as a wave brought him up on the deck that was nearly awash in the storm. Struggling toward the bridge, shouting for Sienna, he found himself pushing through the main hatch, only to be clubbed in the back of the head and slammed to the floor. The impact at the back of his skull nearly knocked him unconscious. He was woozy and dazed. The next thing he knew, someone was slamming him against the bulkhead and trying to choke him. "Where the hell did he come from?" a voice shouted from the other side of the bridge. "There's a rescue copter outside," the man holding him called back. Kurt knocked the man's hand from his throat, but the man flung him down and put him in a headlock. Not one to lose many fights, Kurt was aware of weakness in his limbs that must have come from the initial blow to the back of his head. Having been concussed several times in his life, Kurt recognized the symptoms. The ringing in the ears, tunnel vision, dizziness. The blow should have put him out, might have even killed him. But then again, Kurt has always been a hardhead. He looked up, trying to assess the situation. The man at the far end had a woman by the arm. "Sienna?" Kurt said weakly. She looked over at him. "Kurt?" she said. She tried to pull free and reach for him, but the man yanked her back and handed her off to a subordinate. "Get her to the escape pod. Her husband and the children are already there." Sienna struggled against them, but could not break free. As she was dragged into the ship, Kurt could hear her shouting his name. He tried to stand, but his assailant was too heavy for Kurt to overcome in his current state. "What about the rest of us?" "We'll be joining her as soon as we get rid of this one." The man dropped down beside Kurt, flipped open a knife, and went for the cable that attached Kurt to the harness. Kurt heard the helicopter through the storm and saw the spotlight probing around. It spurred the dim realization that he wouldn't survive if these men cut the cable connecting him to it. He snapped free, kicked the man with the knife, and lunged for the door, only to be tackled again. "Kill him!" The man cocked the hammer on the pistol, but Kurt spun and kicked the man's knee. The weapon discharged, hitting the clear ceramic wall. The wall didn't shatter, but cracks spread across it like veins. Before Kurt could make a second move, a boot caught him in the chin, and the man holding him pressed him down into the water, trying to drown him. Despite every effort, Kurt could not push hard enough to rise up. "Wait!" The order came from a female voice. The man pulled Kurt from the water and held him there.
"We can use him,"
the woman said. As he was allowed to breathe, Kurt stared at the woman. He recognized her. The short dark hair, wet and matted to her head, the high cheekbones. He knew her somehow. Her name was Callista. "He'll tell the world about us," the man said, objecting.
"Someone has to,"
she said cryptically.
"You idiots have killed the captain and the crew. We planned on using them for that purpose."
"We didn't expect them to fight." She dropped down beside Kurt and opened a small case. Kurt could feel the yacht rolling in the swells. It was in danger of going over. Almost unconscious, Kurt fought to stay awake. His strength was gone, his mind clouding over. The woman produced a syringe and jabbed it in his neck. Kurt's mind drifted further. She moved close to his face and held it in both hands.
"You came aboard the yacht,"
she said, her voice a distant echo.
"You saw Sienna beyond this wall."
She turned his head toward it. The cracks caught his eye.
"She was floating face down. Her hair was wet, waving like seagrass."
Kurt stared at the glass wall. The glare of a flashlight reflected off it, blinding him. When it was gone, he could see through the glass. The room was half filled with water. The cushions and papers floated in muck. Sienna was there. He saw her. He lunged toward her, only to bang into the glass.
"She drowned,"
the voice told him,
"along with her daughter. Such a pretty child. Such a shame."
Kurt could see it happening. The little girl in her dress, a tow-headed blonde. Her small fingers were still curled around her mother's hand. He remembered hearing that her name was Elise.
"Her eyes are open,"
the woman said. Kurt winced at the image. He tried again to get to them, but was thrown back to the deck.
"The yacht is sinking,"
the voice told him,
"filling with water. Break the glass. It's your only hope."
Kurt slammed his fist into the glass wall, but it was no use. He couldn't break through.
"You tried to smash it with the chair, but the glass would not fall. Instead, you did."
He was pushed onto his back.
"The yacht is rolling over. You've run out of time."
"No!"
"They're pulling you out."
"No!" Kurt shouted. He felt himself being drawn backward. His mask was ripped off, and then the back of his head slammed against something once again. But instead of finding himself out in the sea, he realized through the haze in his mind that he was still on the bridge. He saw the woman and the others walking away. He heard her speaking to someone by radio.
"Open the seacocks, sink this ship, and let's get out of here."
"What happens when he starts to remember?" another of them said.
"He won't," she insisted. "Not until we let him."
Kurt lost track of them and tried to move. He had to get out of there. He had to escape. He tried to stand, but his arms felt as if they were made of lead. His legs were useless. The water began rushing away from him. The ship was rolling. Suddenly the harness pulled taut around him, dragging him toward the door. It pulled him free and then snapped with a loud twang. He dropped back into the sea. Dazed and barely conscious, he tried to kick for the surface, but knew he was going deeper, pulled down by suction from the sinking yacht. The flashlight on his arm pointed downward, and Kurt saw the blurry outline of the yacht disappearing into the darkness below. He turned his gaze upward, caught a glimpse of the silvery light, and then watched the darkness close around it. Everything went black, until a hand grabbed him and pulled him above the waves. Chapter 47. Kurt woke up quietly. Unlike all the other nights he'd woken from the memory/nightmare, this time he returned to consciousness in a state of peace. He could hear a soft beeping and the sound of a ventilating duct. He opened his eyes slowly and found himself bathed in blazing light. He was not at home, but in a hospital, with a white ceiling, walls, and floor. His pupils, dilated by some medication, were letting in vast amounts of light that turned the dimly lit room into a blazing solarium. He raised a hand to block the glare, but the IV line taped to the crook of his arm made it awkward. He let his arm fall and noticed a pulse meter attached to his finger, which was in turn connected to the monitor, emitting the soft beeping sound. He guessed that meant he was alive. Looking through the glare, he saw a figure across the way. It was Joe, sitting in a chair on the far side of the small room. Joe looked like he'd been up forever. 3 days of stubble covered his face, dark circles rested beneath his eyes. He had a cup of coffee in one hand and a comic book across his knee.
"Didn't know you were a manga guy," Kurt said.
Joe looked up, a warm smile cutting through the haggard look.
"I just look at the pictures," he said, "especially when the words are in a foreign language. As far as I can tell, this one's about an orphan robot who befriends a boy and girl with mutant powers who have a penchant for samurai swords and cupcakes. Though I could be wrong about that."
As Joe held the comic up, Kurt could see the surreal drawings and the Korean lettering in bright red.
"Sometimes pictures don't tell the whole story," he said, thinking about his own experience. "What am I doing in a hospital?"
"Don't you remember? Your girlfriend tricked you into zapping yourself."
"Zapping myself?"
"In the tunnel under the DMZ?"
It took Kurt a minute to recall the extracurricular activities beneath the DMZ, but thankfully he did. He even remembered falling after pressing the button on the screen of the woman's remote. "Considering the quality of care," he said, "I'm going to assume we're in the South. How'd we get back here?"
"We made a run for the border Zavala style," Joe said. "Basically, I saved you, once again. And you missed the whole thing, once again."
"I'll take your word for it," Kurt said.
His eyesight was returning to normal.
"How long have I been out?"
3 days, Joe said.
3 days?
Joe nodded.
"They did some minor brain surgery on you," he explained. "I pointed out to them that any brain surgery on you would have to be minor, but they didn't get the joke. Lost in translation, I guess."
Kurt chuckled. "You've been waiting for me to wake up just so you could say that, haven't you?"
"Pretty much," Joe said.
He put down the comic book and slid his chair over to Kurt, presenting him with a clear plastic vial. Inside was a tiny metal fragment, half the size of a tic-tac. A microchip. "What is it?"
"Simple device," Joe said. "It emits an electronic signal that short-circuits your brain every time they expose it to a certain frequency. The doctors say they've tried similar systems on patients with Parkinson's to control tremors, or on people who've experienced emotional trauma in an effort to rewire the recollection and reduce the emotional pain."
Kurt looked at the chip. He wondered if its removal had allowed his memory to clear, or if the jolt Callista had given him was so powerful that it had somehow overridden the false memory.
"According to the docs, the little thing has to be triggered by a transmitter," Joe added. "Hearing that, Dirk sent a team to sweep your house. They found a transmitter hidden in your garage."
Kurt considered all the trouble the tiny chip had caused him. "That's why the nightmares stopped once I left D.C., and I'm assuming why I can remember being on the yacht now. I even remember you pulling me out of the water."
"That alone has to be worth all the trouble," Joe said.
Kurt nodded and told Joe the memories he'd finally recalled.
"Some of it's still fuzzy," he added,
But Callista was definitely there. They had Sienna. They had her husband and her children, which makes me wonder what he's doing back in the States.
You mean?
I mean, if they're forcing her to do something by holding the children hostage, what are they forcing him to do?
You didn't hear it from me, Joe said, but I'm told the CIA is already wondering the same thing. Supposedly Westgate's about to get the chance to explain himself in person.
Kurt considered that progress. He sat up and pulled the pulse meter off of his finger, causing the monitor to flatline. An alarm sounded, bringing a nurse. She shut off the chirping, checked Kurt's vitals, and called a report into the nursing station. As she left, new visitors arrived. Hale from the CIA with his ever-present partner, Colonel Lee. "You're lucky to be in a hospital," Hale said, "and not in a North Korean prison camp."
Or one of ours, for that matter, Colonel Lee added. You two almost caused a Second Korean War.
Technically, Joe said, the first one never actually ended. There was no peace treaty, only a ceasefire. So it would really be a continuation of the first war.
You think this is funny?
Colonel Lee asked. No, Joe said, but I think the fact that Kurt and I discovered a threat to South Korean security in the form of a secret tunnel from the north has to count for something. Hale gave Colonel Lee a look that said he has a point.
You're both very lucky, Colonel Lee said. Lucky you didn't end up dead or in a North Korean gulag. Lucky that Kim Jong-un is denying any such tunnel exists and claiming these are all imperialist lies rather than admitting 24 of his men were killed in the skirmish. Lucky that calmer heads prevailed. It's taken 3 days for the sides to calm down, but tensions are almost back to normal.
Kurt was glad to hear that. Maybe we went too far, he said. We'll definitely be more careful next time. Sorry, Kurt, but there's not going to be a next time, Hale said. The words were delivered with a tinge of regret, even sadness. What are you talking about? Kurt said. We've proved Sienna is alive. We know these people have her and the other hackers on that list. We have to go after them before they do something terrible. The trail's gone cold, Hale explained. There are no leads left to follow. Tan Rang is locked up in a maximum security prison surrounded by guards and lawyers, and he's not talking to anyone. Your mystery woman and the hackers have vanished without a trace. What about Acosta? Kurt said. He took our tracking device. You should be able to activate it and find him. We tried that, Hale said. No luck. This country is a peninsula, Kurt pointed out. Considering the roadblock to the north, it might as well be an island. They can't just drive off into the sunset, especially when they're supposed to be under surveillance. We're watching the airports and all the major harbors, Hale said, but we've seen nothing so far. Acosta wouldn't be fool enough to book a commercial flight. There were too many other ways to get out. Hundreds of merchant vessels steaming in and out of Korean ports every day. Beyond that, there were thousands of small watercraft or privately owned jets. And even if something does turn up, Hale added, it won't be your job to follow up. Kurt narrowed his gaze, all but burning holes in Hale with his eyes. I've been on the phone with your boss back in D.C., Hale said. He agrees with me that Numa's involvement in this situation has run its course and is now at an end. If any other leads do surface, they'll be followed up on by Central Intelligence or Special Forces personnel under the direction of the NSA. Kurt knew the sound of a dismissal when he heard it. It sucked the air right out of him. He glanced over at Joe. I spoke with Dirk, too, Joe said. He wanted you to know. It's time to let this go. Kurt leaned back against the bed. If there was an emptier feeling on Earth, Kurt hadn't felt it. They'd been so close. He'd finally found Sienna. He'd actually had her in his arms. Now she was gone. Again. The doctors insist you're ready to be discharged, Hale said. We're going to move you immediately, since we have reason to believe that Tan Rang or even Acosta may have agents hanging around who'd like to kill you both. You'll be flown out of here at dusk on a military C-17 headed for Guam. From there, it's on to Hawaii and some R&R. Enjoy it, if you can.
Kurt didn't respond, and Hale straightened up and made his way toward the door. He stopped to offer one more comment before he left. "I'll give you this, Kurt. You put on one hell of a show."
End of CD 9.